Story 1. The Winter of Iron and Ash. The winter came early that year, fierce and unrelenting, sweeping across the kingdoms like a gray wolf with cold breath and teeth of ice. As the snows fell thick upon the timbered roofs of the village of Eldhollow, life slowed to a near halt. The streets grew silent, save for the crunching of boots and the groaning of wooden carts pulled by shivering oxen. It was the year 1274, a time when lords weighed gold by the ounce and peasants weighed bread by the crumb. In this harsh season, when the rivers froze thick as stone and the forests stood as skeletal guardians wrapped in frost, survival was not granted but fought for tooth and nail. Beneath the shadow of Blackpine Castle, where Lord Aldrich the Iron Hand ruled with measured justice and the scars of 10 campaigns across his face, the people of Eldhollow prepared for the longest, coldest winter in living memory. They gathered firewood, salted meats, patched roofs as snow crept in through every crack and seam like an invading army, and prayed their stores would last. The village baker, old Tomlin, fired his ovens day and night, the scent of rye and barley clinging to the air even as flour dust settled like fresh snow upon his beard. The blacksmith, Garrick of the Forge, hammered iron with numb fingers, shaping horseshoes, axe heads, and the occasional blade for Lord Aldrich's men who patrolled the roads now lost beneath snowdrifts. The market, once bustling with traders, now stood nearly empty. The few remaining merchants huddled by their carts, bartering salted fish and coarse wool for what few silver pennies remained in the villagers' pouches. As the Yule season approached, the people clung to old traditions, lighting pinewood torches and hanging woven wreaths upon their doors in defiance of the cold, as if flame and greenery could stave off the creeping frost. In the great hall of Blackpine Castle, a fire roared within a hearth tall enough for a man to stand inside. Lord Aldrich, his once dark hair now streaked with silver, brooded upon his oaken throne, for his scouts had brought troubling tidings. The pass to the south, the only trade route still open before the snow had sealed the mountain roads, had been taken by a band of raiders, men from the northern fens, clad in furs and iron, desperate as their own stores dwindled. These were not mere thieves but hardened warriors who had abandoned their dying villages and now sought survival at the expense of others, their blades sharp and their eyes colder than the frost that rimmed their beards. Aldrich, bound by duty to his people, summoned his war council, and within the stone walls, the echo of urgent voices rose like the howl of the wind outside. Among them was Sir Burin, the youngest of Aldrich's knights, whose loyalty burned hotter than the hearth fire, and Lady Iseldra, Aldrich's daughter, whose sharp mind and iron will had earned her a seat at the table, though many in the court still whispered of her unwed state, as if a woman without a husband could not bear the weight of command. The decision was made swiftly. Aldrich would lead a contingent south to reclaim the pass, for without it, Eldhollow would starve before the thaw. Wrapped in furs, their banners snapping in the bitter wind, the company rode out, their breath hanging in the air like smoke, hooves breaking through the snow-crusted roads as the village watched in silence, their hopes pinned upon the armored figures vanishing into the white horizon. Days passed, the sky perpetually gray, the sun a pale memory behind thick clouds, and in the village, fear grew like ivy upon stone, creeping, tightening as food stores shrank and the cold seeped into bone and marrow. Tomlin the baker rationed his loaves, Garrick the blacksmith doused his forge to conserve wood, and mothers clutched their children closer at night as the wolves grew bold, their howls echoing from the forest's edge. Then came word, a rider staggering into the village, half frozen, his face pale as death, bearing the seal of Blackpine. Lord Aldrich had engaged the raiders at Frostmere Bridge, and though the battle had been fierce, they had driven the enemy back into the snow-choked forests. But victory had come at a price. Aldrich himself was gravely wounded, an axe bite deep into his thigh, and the wound had festered in the cold, spreading fever through his blood. As the village braced for the return of their lord, Lady Iseldra took the mantle of leadership, her voice steady in the hall where the lords once sat. She organized the remaining stores, dispatched hunters into the woods despite the danger, and offered what little solace she could to the frightened people. When Aldrich returned, he was a shadow of the man he had been, carried upon a litter, his breath shallow, his skin flushed with the fire of sickness, and though healers worked tirelessly by his side, the winter's grip proved too strong. On the 12th night of Yule, beneath flickering candlelight, Lord Aldrich passed beyond the veil, his daughter at his side, his hand clasping hers as the last of his strength ebbed away. The bells of Eldhallow tolled a mournful dirge, their iron tongues ringing through the snow-laden streets as the people mourned not just their lord but the symbol of their endurance, the man who had kept them safe through war and famine. Lady Iseldra, her grief carved deep but her resolve harder still, donned the cloak of her house, dark as midnight and trimmed with the fur of the white wolf, and ascended to her father's seat amidst the protests of some who clung to old traditions that favored male heirs. Yet as the snows continued to fall and the wolves prowled ever closer, the people of Eldhallow came to see not a woman out of place, but a leader born of necessity, her commands clear, her judgments fair, and her courage unwavering. Under her guidance, the village endured the bitterest stretch of winter, surviving on thin stew, hunted venison, and the stubborn will to see another spring. She sent emissaries to neighboring holds, reopened the trade pass with armed escorts, and brokered fragile truces with those who, like the raiders, had turned to desperation in the face of nature's cruelty. When the first thaw came, when the icicles began to weep and the river's frozen skin cracked to reveal dark water beneath, Eldhallow remained, battered but standing, its people alive, its hearths still warm. Lady Iseldra became known not as a placeholder for a future husband, but as the Lady of the Long Winter, a ruler who had faced the cold and commanded the fires to burn brighter, whose name would be etched not in the lineage of lords but in the grateful hearts of those who had endured beside her. And so, as the seasons turned and the snows melted into memory, the story of that harsh winter passed into legend, told beside fires and within the walls of castles, a tale not merely of frost and famine, but of iron-willed leaders, of sacrifices made beneath a gray sky, and of the quiet, persistent heartbeat of a village that chose, despite all odds, to survive. Story 2. The Siege Beneath the Snow. The winter sky hung low over the fortress of Greyfen, its heavy clouds pressing upon the ancient stone walls as if the heavens themselves wished to smother the last flame of hope flickering within. Snow had been falling for weeks without pause, blanketing the fields, the forests, the battlements, until the world seemed carved from ice and silence. It was the harshest winter in a generation, and to make matters worse, the fortress, perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking the river Vane, had been under siege since the final days of autumn. Lord Hadric, master of Greyfen, stood upon the parapet, his thick fur cloak snapping in the sharp wind, his steel-gray eyes scanning the endless white that stretched beyond the outer wall, where the banners of Lord Morian's rebel host fluttered defiantly. Hadric's beard was stiff with frost, and his gauntlets clutched the stone crenellations until his knuckles ached. He had held Greyfen through war, through famine, through the death of his beloved wife, but this siege in the dead of winter was testing even his iron will. Inside the fortress, supplies dwindled. The grain bins had been sealed and rationed since the first snow, and the salted meats, once counted by the dozens of barrels, were now reduced to a few sad racks hanging in the dark, cold cellars. The well inside the keep still ran, a blessing, though the water tasted faintly of stone and iron. The people within Greyfen's walls, soldiers and villagers alike, had taken to burning broken furniture and scavenged crates to keep their hearths alive. The chapel's wooden benches were reduced to kindling, and even the great hall's carved chairs had vanished, one by one, to feed the fires. Yet Hadric would not surrender. He could not. Lord Morian, his former vassal turned traitor, demanded the keys to Greyfen, demanded Hadric's fealty, demanded his life. But Hadric had sworn his sword to King Idrun, and though the king's banner no longer flew over these contested lands, Hadric's oath still bound him. Even in this frozen corner of the kingdom, where no messengers came, where no reinforcements would ride, his honor would not thaw under the weight of desperation. Each morning, the gates remained sealed. Each night, the fires along the walls burned low but steady. Captain Isric, his most trusted officer, a man with a crooked nose and a quiet resolve, drilled the remaining soldiers though their bellies ached with hunger and their hands trembled with cold. Hadric's daughter, Lady Evelyn, tended the sick and wounded in the barracks, binding frost-bitten limbs, distributing the last of the herbs, and offering comfort where food could not. Her bravery became a quiet legend among the garrison, a beacon in the dark as the siege dragged on. The besieging army, too, suffered under the relentless winter. Scouts reported that Morian's men had begun to die in the snow, their supply lines cut by the storms that swallowed the southern roads. Wolves roamed between the camps at night, and hunger gnawed at friend and foe alike. Yet Morian did not lift the siege. His pride was as frozen and unyielding as the river that circled Greyfen like a moat of glass. One bitter dawn, a herald approached the gate, wrapped in furs but visibly shivering, his voice cracking as he read Morian's final offer. Lay down arms, open the gates, and the people of Greyfen would be spared. Resist, and the fortress would be taken by force, its defenders shown no mercy. Hadric listened, then calmly rejected the terms, sending the herald back with a simple answer carved into a piece of blackened oak. We endure. The words spread quickly through the fortress, whispered from mouth to mouth, until they became a defiant chant among the soldiers. We endure. The days bled into weeks, and the cold deepened. Food grew so scarce that rats became prized catches, and the smallest crust of bread was divided with reverence. Yet despite the gnawing hunger, the people of Greyfen did not break. Evelyn's resolve became the fortress's backbone, her presence a balm to the weary. She organized the kitchens, saw to the fires, and when the meat ran out, she led the desperate hunt for roots and bark that could stave off starvation for another day. Then came the assault. Desperate to end the siege before his own army crumbled from hunger and frost, Morian launched a furious attack, battering the outer wall with siege engines whose wheels barely turned in the snow. His men, wrapped in scavenged furs, stormed the battlements with ladders and battering rams, but the defenders of Greyfen, though weakened, fought with a ferocity born of sheer survival. Captain Isric's sword flashed red in the dawn light as he cut down the first wave. Hadric himself, though his joints ached and his vision blurred, took up his axe and waded into the fray, his roars echoing across the frozen courtyard. 4 hours, the battle raged, the snow stained crimson, the clash of iron muffled by the thickening flurries. Lady Evelyn moved among the wounded, pulling men from beneath collapsed ramparts, binding wounds with torn strips of her own cloak, her hands red with the blood of both friend and enemy. As dusk approached, a strange stillness settled over the field. Morian's final push had failed. His soldiers, starving and frostbitten, broke and scattered into the woods, pursued by the wolves that had long awaited the feast. The siege was broken, but the victory was hollow. Less than half of Hadric's men remained, and their faces were pale, their eyes sunken. In the aftermath, the survivors gathered in the great hall, now nearly stripped bare, to honor the fallen. Hadric, his hand resting on Evelyn's shoulder, declared that Greyfen had stood not because of walls or swords, but because of the hearts that refused to surrender. They endured because they chose to endure. They endured because honor meant something, even in the teeth of winter. But the trials were not over. The winter still pressed upon them, and though the enemy had fled, starvation lingered like a shadow. It was Evelyn who took charge in the days that followed, leading foraging parties into the snowbound woods, negotiating with neighboring villages that had weathered the storm with fuller stores. She sent riders to distant holds, bartering precious silver and even family heirlooms for sacks of grain and dried meats. Slowly, life began to return to Greyfen. The dead were buried beneath the snow, their names carved into the stone walls with trembling hands. The chapel was rebuilt, its benches replaced with rough-hewn planks. The fires burned brighter. Evelyn's leadership became a story told beyond the fortress walls, her name spoken with respect across the northern marches. When the first thaw finally came, when the ice cracked upon the river and the first green shoots dared to push through the snow, the people of Greyfen gathered at the gates. Hadric, now leaning heavily upon his cane, passed his cloak to his daughter, a silent gesture that echoed louder than any proclamation. She would lead them now as the Lady of Greyfen. She had earned it not through birthright alone, but through sacrifice, through resilience, through the stubborn refusal to bend. And as spring unfolded, bringing warmth and the return of birdsong, Evelyn led her people in rebuilding not just their walls but their spirit. The winter of the siege became a memory etched deep into the stones of Greyfen, a story passed from mother to child, from soldier to recruit, of a time when snow and steel conspired to break them, and yet they endured. And though many years would pass and other winters would come, none would ever be as fierce as the winter beneath the siege, nor would any leader be as beloved as the young woman who refused to let the last flame of hope be smothered by the falling snow. For in the end, Grey Fen did not survive because it was well fortified, nor because its soldiers were the strongest, but because its people, through hunger, through loss, through the longest nights, whispered to themselves, again and again, a simple vow: we endure. Story 3. The Winter Pact. The winter of the year of the fallen star descended upon the valley of Varencourt with a cruelty that the oldest among them could scarcely remember, a season so bitter that even the river's relentless current surrendered to ice, and the trees of the Blackwood stood like brittle bones against the gray sky. Storytellers would later say that the cold came not from the clouds, but from the earth itself, a punishment for broken oaths and forgotten gods. But for the people of Varencourt, such tales meant little when the snows piled higher than a man's chest and the wind clawed through the thickest cloaks. Beneath the snow-draped battlements of Varencourt Keep, life slowed to a crawl. The merchants had fled before the first frost, the livestock had been slaughtered for want of fodder, and the people now huddled near the great hearths, clutching at warmth as they rationed their dwindling supplies. It was in this grim season that Lord Oswin, the last son of House Varencourt, faced a choice that would echo for generations. Oswin, a man of 30 winters, was no stranger to hardship. His father had fallen in the border wars, his elder brother claimed by a fever, and his younger sister lost to a hunting accident long whispered to be more than mere mischance. Now, with the valley cut off by impassable passes and the snows burying all hope of relief, Oswin bore the weight of his people's survival upon his scarred shoulders. The castle's steward, old Master Corbin, had delivered the grim tally. Barley stores would last no more than a fortnight, and the salted fish, poorly packed in the hurried days of autumn, had begun to rot in their barrels. Game had vanished from the woods, driven away or perhaps taken by the wolves whose howls now haunted the long nights. The people whispered of a coming doom, of the long hunger, of the pale sickness that traveled on empty stomachs. Some said the cold would not lift until spring, and some said spring would never come. Oswin stood in the high tower overlooking his snowbound domain, the sky a dull sheet of pewter above him, the breath of the keep freezing in thin mists around the chimneys. He watched the torches flicker along the outer walls and knew that courage alone would not feed his people. It was then that Oswin's aunt, the Lady Vera, came to him with a name long forbidden, a name buried in the stones of the old faith, in the prayers whispered before the temples were burned. The Winter Pact, she called it, a desperate bargain, struck in the darkest hours by lords who had once bent their knees not to kings but to the old spirits, those that lingered beyond the snow and the bone. Vera's voice trembled as she spoke, her lined face half shrouded in her fur-lined hood, for she knew the cost of such a pact could be more than mere coin. But the alternative was starvation. The village fires were guttering out, the mothers weeping as their children's bellies shrank. The Winter Pact, she said, could bring sustenance, could deliver Varencourt from the edge of ruin. Oswin was a man of the new order, a man who had set aside the old superstitions, yet desperation claws through the walls of conviction. And so, beneath a moon choked by storm clouds, he rode alone into the Blackwood, guided by Vera's words and the memory of paths long overgrown. The heart of the forest was silent, the snow swallowing hoofbeats, the bare branches creaking like ancient doors. Deep within the woods, where the trees grew so thick that even the snow dared not settle, Oswin found the place, a hollow where no birds sang, where the air itself seemed to freeze in his lungs. There, upon a stone altar cracked with age, he called out in the tongue Vera had taught him, words older than his house, older than the kingdom, perhaps older than the winter itself. For hours, he waited, the cold gnawing at his fingers, his resolve thinning like the tattered banners of his keep. Then, from the shadows, it came. The spirit wore the form of a stag, but its eyes burned like coals, and its breath steamed as though from a furnace. It did not speak with words but with the grinding of branches, with the pulse of the wind against his chest. The pact was offered, food enough to survive the winter, but at a price Oswin would not know until the thaw. When he returned to the keep, weary and numb, the snow had begun to melt, not entirely, but enough for the hunters to find game waiting at the edge of the woods, enough for the foragers to uncover buried roots, enough for the river's ice to crack and reveal fish teeming beneath the surface. The people of Varencourt rejoiced, their bellies filling as their faith in Oswin hardened into legend. Yet Oswin did not celebrate. He watched each success with suspicion, each abundance with unease, for he knew bargains made in the depths of winter do not dissolve with the spring sun. The thaw came slowly, the ice receding, the green creeping back into the valley, and yet Oswin's dread only deepened. In his dreams, he heard the crunch of hooves upon snow, the scrape of antlers against stone. The price would come. He had fed his people, but at what cost? Summer bloomed across the valley, the fields rich, the children laughing once more in the courtyards, and still, Oswin waited for the shadow he had invited. It came not as plague, nor as war, but as silence. On the eve of harvest, Oswin's infant son was found lifeless in his cradle, untouched by sickness, his small form cold as stone though the hearth nearby had burned all night. A deer's antler, blackened and cracked, lay at the foot of the cradle. Grief struck Oswin like a sword, but even as he mourned, he understood the pact had been kept. The spirit had provided sustenance in exchange for what was most precious to him. Lady Vera wept at his side, for she, too, had known what the price might be, though she had dared to hope the old powers would show mercy. The years passed, and Varencourt prospered. The tale of the long winter became a fireside legend, a testament to Oswin's leadership, though only he and Vera knew the full truth. Oswin never again returned to the Blackwood. He forbade the woods to be hunted, forbade fires to be kindled within its borders, forbade even the gathering of fallen branches. It remained a place apart, a place untouched. As age crept upon him, Oswin would often walk the battlements at dusk, watching the treetops sway like distant hands, knowing the old spirits still lingered, still watching, still waiting. His people called him the Lord of the Winter's Mercy, never guessing that mercy had come at a price. And though his halls rang with songs of plenty and the laughter of grandchildren not his own, his heart remained a hollow place, echoing with the sound of unseen hooves and the whispered weight of the pact he could never unmake. And so, in the cold seasons that followed, the people of Varencourt would look upon their full tables, their heavy grain stores, their rich harvests, and give thanks for the strength of Lord Oswin, never knowing that beneath the stone of their hearths, beneath the roots of their valley, an ancient debt still pulsed, a quiet promise carved into the bones of winter. Some debts, after all, are never truly paid. Story 4. The Frostbane Caravan. The winter of the Iron Roads was unlike any that had come before it, a season of brutal storms and endless snow that swallowed not only the weak but also the proud. In the far reaches of the kingdom of Harrowmere, where the mountains rose sharp and merciless against the sky, a caravan set out against the weight of the season, carrying the last hope of 3 villages toward the distant city of Baelwatch. The roads, ancient stone paths carved into the hills, were now nearly impassable, strangled by drifts of snow and the creeping ice that coiled like serpents across the cobblestones. The caravan, known thereafter as the Frostbane Caravan, was led by Captain Rowan Drager, a man with a heart forged by hardship and a reputation that traveled ahead of him like the echo of distant thunder. Rowan had seen winters before, had marched through them as a soldier, had buried men in the snow, had made fire from broken shields and frozen cloth. Yet this winter gnawed at the world with a hunger he had never witnessed. The snows fell in sheets, the winds howled like beasts starved of flesh, and the cold burrowed into marrow and soul alike. His mission was simple in words but near impossible in deed: deliver wagons laden with grain, salt pork, and precious medicines from Harrowmere's royal stores to the starving settlements of Frostmere, Eldholt, and Brackenfield, villages cut off by storms that had closed the mountain passes and driven the wolves into boldness. Behind Rowan rode a band of the hardiest guards, each clad in boiled leather beneath heavy furs, faces wrapped in scarves stiff with frost, eyes sharp, hands steady on their spears and crossbows. The caravan's wagons creaked beneath their burdens as they pressed forward through the frozen landscape, the horses laboring with every step, their breaths rising in clouds that quickly froze and drifted away like silver ghosts. The journey would take them through the hollow pass, a narrow gorge where avalanches could seal their fate in an instant, and then across the iron roads themselves, treacherous paths now smothered by the white siege of winter. Each day was a battle against the elements. Snow blinded them, sleet turned the road to glass, and the cold bit through layers of cloth as if they wore nothing at all. Yet Rowan drove them onward, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind, his determination an iron chain binding the caravan together. At night, they made camp in hollows carved from the drifts, stacking firewood high and setting sentries to watch for more than just bandits. Wolves prowled at the edge of their fires, their eyes glinting like dying stars. On the 7th night, the first wagon broke an axle, and the men labored in silence to repair it as the snow piled upon their shoulders. On the 10th night, they lost a horse to the cold. They pressed on. Rowan's second, a grizzled veteran named Halric, urged him to turn back, to save what men and supplies they could. But Rowan refused. He thought of the villages. He had seen famine before, had seen children with hollow eyes, had buried them beneath stone and frost. He would not fail these people. Word of the Frostbane caravan spread ahead of them, carried by desperate messengers and frightened travelers. Villagers in Eldholt began to build great signal fires, feeding them with their last scraps of wood to guide Rowan through the swirling white. In Frostmere, mothers prayed by frozen hearts, clutching their starving children. In Brackenfield, the last stores of grain had already been scraped clean. The caravan was not just a mission, it was salvation. On the 13th day, the hollow pass nearly buried them. A cascade of snow thundered down the gorge, cutting the road behind them and stranding them between the cliffs. They lost 2 men, buried beneath the suffocating white. The caravan wept, but Rowan steeled them. They pressed on. The wolves grew bolder. On the 15th night, they came in packs, slipping between the trees, their hunger outweighing their fear of fire. The guards fought them off, their spears splintering, their torches burning low, the darkness ringing with snarls and the clash of steel. Blood stained the snow, but the caravan endured. They moved by day, fought by night, and measured their lives not by the days that passed but by the miles remaining. When they finally reached Eldholt, they found the village on the edge of collapse. Fires guttered, faces hollowed by starvation, but the people wept when they saw the wagons. Grain was distributed, medicines given to the sick, and the villagers clung to Rowan's hands with cracked, frozen fingers. Yet the journey was far from over. Rowan turned the caravan toward Frostmere, driving his men harder. Halric, now fevered from a wolf bite, begged Rowan to leave him behind, but Rowan strapped him to the last wagon, vowing to see him home. The road to Frostmere was worse than the one before, bridges sagging under the weight of ice, fallen trees blocking the path. Twice, they nearly lost the lead wagon to the cracking stone beneath them. On the 19th night, Rowan awoke to find the supplies covered in a fresh layer of snow and the horses too weak to rise. They built sleds from shattered wagon frames and dragged the supplies with their own shoulders, their breath ragged, their muscles burning, but they did not stop. When they reached Frostmere, the villagers were so near to death they could barely stand. Rowan's men distributed the last of the grain with hands that trembled from exhaustion. Frostmere's elder wept openly, calling Rowan a savior, a name he rejected. He was no savior, he told them, just a man who would not let the snow win. They rested only long enough to regain the strength to make the final push to Brackenfield. Rowan had promised he would reach all 3 villages, and no storm, no beast, no mountain would break that vow. The journey to Brackenfield was the cruelest. The iron roads were no longer roads but white tombs, where stone markers were buried beneath the snow and the path was guessed more than known. The guards now numbered barely half of those who had begun the journey. Halric's fever worsened, but he clung to life, driven by Rowan's stubborn will. On the 25th day, they crossed the frozen Greyfen River, its ice groaning beneath them, cracks chasing their footsteps. When they reached Brackenfield, they found it clinging to life by a thread. Rowan collapsed at the village gate, the last of the supplies lashed to his sled, his hands frozen raw. The people rushed to them, tears freezing on their cheeks, and as the food was distributed, Rowan allowed himself to fall into the snow, exhausted but victorious. The Frostbane caravan became a legend not just of endurance but of impossible determination. Rowan's name passed from tongue to tongue, not as a hero draped in finery but as a man who kept walking, kept pulling, kept breathing when the world told him to stop. How Rick survived the fever, his story forever tied to the man who dragged him through ice and wolves and storms. When the spring thaw came, the iron roads revealed the scars of their passing, the broken axles, the discarded frames, the frozen markers of their fallen. Villages erected stone cairns along the paths, tributes to the nameless who gave their lives so others might see another season. And Rowan? He returned to Harrowmere, but he never again took comfort in a warm hearth. He walked the iron roads in the winters that followed, leading caravans, guiding others through the snows, as if he could not bear to let another man face the white silence alone. His legend was carved into stone, but he never sought glory. He had faced winter, not to be remembered, but because it was there. Because it was cold. Because people were starving. Because someone had to walk the road. Story 5. The Last Hearth of Windmere. The winter that fell upon the highlands of Windmere was cruel, sudden, and absolute, a season that silenced birdsong, stopped rivers in their tracks, and turned the proud stone towers of Windmere Hold into cold prisons of ice and despair. The snow began its siege in the final days of autumn, falling in great walls of white that buried the roadways, cut the valleys off from the lowland cities, and locked the villagers behind their doors as if the very earth had exiled them. It was a winter that spared no one, neither noble nor peasant, neither beast nor man. The winds howled through the mountain passes like ancient spirits, and each sunrise seemed to bring more frost, more silence, more reminders of how small and fragile life truly was beneath the vast, unfeeling sky. Windmere Hold, perched atop the cliffs overlooking the frozen expanse of Lake Therin, belonged to Lord Edric of House Morwen, a man known for his quiet strength and measured rule. His people respected him not for grand conquests or golden halls, but because he understood the rhythm of the seasons, the weight of the land, the simple truths of survival. Yet even he had not foreseen the depth of this winter's cruelty. By the second moon, the stores of grain had withered to a handful of sacks. The cellars that once brimmed with salted fish and venison now echoed with emptiness. The sheep had long since perished, their bones buried beneath the snowdrifts. The hunts had failed, the rivers yielded no fish, and the villagers of Windmere had begun to burn their own walls for warmth. Lord Edric stood often upon the eastern battlements, wrapped in the thick gray cloak of his house, his beard rimed with frost, his breath pluming like the fires that no longer roared within his halls. His daughter, Lady Ira, walked the walls with him, her steps steady despite the cold, her spirit unshaken even as the people whispered that the winter would claim them all. She organized the remaining stores with precision, ensuring that no mouth went unfed, though the portions grew smaller with each passing day. She distributed wood with the same care, knowing that warmth was as precious as bread. When the men despaired, they looked not to their lord but to Ira, who walked among them, unafraid, sharing their thin soups, their frigid nights, their burden. But Windmere's strength alone would not be enough. To survive the coming weeks, they needed help. The nearest hold, Dunley, sat across the frozen Lake Therin, a distance of nearly 30 leagues. The lake, solid now beneath the weight of the season, offered the only possible path. Yet it was not a road without peril. The ice groaned and shifted, the storms turned the horizon into a blur of white, and there were stories, old stories, of things that moved beneath the ice, ancient forces that punished the desperate. Still, Lord Edric resolved to send a party across the lake. It was a gamble, a sliver of hope upon which the fate of Windmere now balanced. Supplies were gathered, what little could be spared, and the strongest of the guard volunteered to make the crossing. Among them was Ser Thomund, a knight of the hold whose sword arm was matched only by his loyalty to Ira. He would lead them, driving the sleds over the ice, braving the storms and the shifting, cracking lake beneath their feet. As the party departed, Ira pressed a small iron pendant into his hand, a relic of their house, a charm said to ward against misfortune. Thomund accepted it without words, but his eyes carried the weight of the promise he had made, to return. The crossing of Lake Therin was harsher than any had feared. The storms lashed at their faces, the ice split beneath their sleds, and on the third night, one man vanished into the white, lost to the unseen cracks that spiderwebbed through the lake's surface. Yet they pressed on, driven by the memory of those waiting behind. Days passed, each step a test of endurance. They faced not only the cold but the ancient fears that gnawed at them in the silent dark. Shapes moved beneath the ice, shadows that slithered just out of sight, whispers that rose with the winds. The men spoke of the wraiths of therein, of the frozen spirits that claimed the desperate. Yet Thomund urged them onward, clutching the iron pendant, his mind fixed on Ira's face, on the fires that still burned faintly in Windmere's hearths. When at last they reached Dunley, their arrival was met with disbelief. None had dared the lake in living memory. Lord Mervan of Dunley, moved by their desperate courage, opened his stores without hesitation, offering grain, salted meats, and timber, and provided sturdy sleds and fresh horses for their return. The journey back was no less perilous. The storms thickened, and the ice groaned louder, as if the lake itself resented their passage. One night, as they camped amid the white expanse, a great crack split the ice, and a chasm yawned beneath them. One sled plunged into the dark, supplies and all, but the rest scrambled to higher ground, dragging what they could salvage. Thomund believed he saw something within that abyss, something vast and ancient, its form unclear, but its presence undeniable. He clutched the pendant, whispering the names of those he vowed to save, and the chasm slowly sealed with the groan of shifting ice. When the caravan reached Windmere, they found the hold clinging to life, the people gaunt but still breathing, the fires weak but still lit. Ira greeted Thomund at the gates, her relief a silent storm in her eyes. The supplies were distributed swiftly, and though they would not erase the scars of the winter, they were enough to see Windmere through to the thaw. Lord Edric clasped Thomund's arm with pride and gratitude, but it was to Ira that Thomund's gaze always returned. The winter slowly released its grip, and spring arrived, cautious but steady. Windmere Hold endured, not because of the strength of its walls, but because of the resolve of its people, the quiet leadership of Lady Ira, and the unwavering courage of those who crossed the frozen abyss. The tale of the crossing passed into legend, the story of the brave who defied the storms, the ice, and the ancient things that stirred beneath the lake. And though the people of Windmere would one day forget the taste of those bitter days, the stone pendant remained, hanging from a beam above the great hearth, a silent token of the winter that nearly claimed them, and the man who would not let the last hearth go cold. Story 6. The Crows of Hearthwind Keep. The winter that descended upon Hearthwind Keep was a silent conqueror, creeping in from the northern cliffs where the sea winds turned to blades and the waves froze mid-crash against the black rocks. It arrived without warning, stealing across the stone walls in a single moon's turning, locking the surrounding lands beneath a shroud of snow and ice so heavy it silenced the forests, sealed the ports, and choked the roads in drifts so high that travelers disappeared within them as though swallowed whole by the earth. This was no ordinary season. It was a siege of cold that turned the hearts of men as brittle as the branches of the skeletal trees. In Hearthwind, the people soon understood that this winter would not pass quickly. Within the fortress walls, Lady Mara of House Hearthwind took stock of their stores with a grim eye. Her husband, Lord Rennick, had ridden south in the early autumn to answer the king's summons for war and had not returned before the snows fell. Messages ceased. Riders sent beyond the gates vanished into the white. Mara had seen many winters, but this one arrived with a weight that made her bones ache, a stillness that pressed upon the world like the breath of ancient gods displeased. The larders shrank quickly. The salted mutton soured in the barrels, and the grain stores yielded less with each anxious measure. Wood, precious as coin, was burned through at an unforgiving pace. The hearths glowed dimmer by the day. When the crows came, thick as smoke upon the parapets, Mara took it as a sign. The villagers began to murmur. The crows were more than scavengers, they said. In the old tongue, they were harbingers, spirits drawn to the scent of death, messengers of winters that devoured the unworthy. When Mara passed through the bailey, the people lowered their gazes, their hope thinning as the sky darkened. She heard their whispered doubts, their prayers to saints long abandoned, and yet she stood tall, her furs clinging to her thin frame, her iron will the only thing holding the keep together. She forbade her people to harm the crows. Let them come. Let them watch. She would not be broken beneath their gaze. The days shortened until the sun barely crept above the horizon, leaving the sky painted in perpetual bruises. Hunters returned empty-handed, their cheeks hollow and their fingers blackened by frostbite. Children grew pale, their laughter replaced by quiet whimpers. The carpenter's hall was torn down for firewood, followed by the gatehouse stairs, the merchant stalls, even the benches of the chapel. Each plank surrendered to the fires brought warmth for but a few moments, but it was enough to see another dawn. Yet dawns became harder to chase. The sickness came, as it always did in such winters. A fever that burned even as the air froze. It claimed the weak first, the eldest, the youngest, and it crept through the keep like a shadow no fire could banish. Mara did not falter. She tended the sick with her own hands when the healers could not. She rationed the food when the steward grew faint-hearted. She ordered the soldiers to escort foragers beyond the walls, into the forests heavy with snow, though the trees yielded little but frozen bark and the occasional stubborn root. Every day, she walked among the people, her voice steady, her orders sharp, even as her own strength withered. The crows grew bolder, perching upon the battlements in black waves, watching her, mocking her, perhaps waiting for the final surrender. Some men began to speak openly of abandoning the keep, of fleeing south in the hope of finding roads unblocked by the snow. Mara forbade it. The cold would take them within hours. They would die with no cairn, no names upon stone. She would not let her people vanish like whispers into the snow. Desperate, Mara summoned the remaining guards and ordered an expedition to the cliffs where the sea ice had gripped the shore. It was said that even in the worst winters, fish could sometimes be found trapped beneath the crust of the frozen waves, and that seaweed, though bitter and tough, could be boiled to sustain life. Ser Calder, her captain, a man who had long stood at her husband's side, led the party with grim determination. They hacked a path through the drifts with axes and shields, dragging sleds behind them like funeral processions. The wind battered them, the snow blinding, but they reached the coast on the third day. What they found was not salvation, but the remains of a ship, its timbers shattered upon the ice, its sails frozen in mid-collapse. Within its broken hull, they found barrels of salted cod and dried fruits, their contents preserved beneath the weight of snow and time. It was a miracle, the guards said, though Mara wondered what ship had dared these waters so late in the season and why the sea had delivered it to her now. They salvaged what they could and dragged it back to the keep, their return greeted by cries that Mara had not heard in weeks. Laughter, relief, life. The fish sustained them. The dried fruits revived the sick. The crows lingered, but their cries seemed less cruel now, their patience unrewarded. Yet Mara knew that the cost of survival is rarely paid in full. When spring finally broke the ice, when the rivers sang again and the trees bloomed pale green, a rider arrived from the south. Lord Rennick had fallen in the King's War. His body lay in an unmarked grave, far from home, his sword claimed by the mud of a distant battlefield. Mara received the news without tears. She gathered the people in the bailey and told them what they had endured would not be forgotten, that the price of their survival was written in the frost upon the stones and in the names of the dead who would not see the thaw. She buried the memories of Lord Rennick beneath the chapel, beneath the new benches carved from the ship's timbers, beneath the weight of a winter that had tried to erase them all. She stood upon the walls once more, her hair streaked with silver, her hands still steady, and watched as the last of the crows took flight, their dark wings vanishing into the warmth of the coming season. The people of Hearthwind would remember the winter of the crows not as a time of famine or death, but as a season when they were tempered like steel, when their lady refused to bend, when the fires never truly died. And long after Mara's time, when the stone walls crumbled and new lords took their place, the story of the ship, the crows, and the woman who defied the cold would remain etched in the hearts of the people, carried forward like the echoes of wings upon the wind. Story 7. The Winter Bell of Eldhollow. The winter that sealed Eldhollow was the kind that arrived like a war drum in the night, a cold so fierce it crept through stone walls, strangled rivers, and turned the sky to dull iron for months without end. In the highlands of the North March, winters were always harsh, but this one came with a sharpness that bit deeper than memory, a silence that stretched beyond the reach of prayer. It was the kind of winter that made men question their faith and made their ancestors' stories seem less like superstition and more like warning. Beneath the weight of endless snowfall, the people of Eld Hollow clung to life, watching their fires fade to embers and their bread crumble to ash in their mouths. At the heart of Eld Hollow stood the old bell tower, its timber frame sagging beneath the heavy snow, its bell long since silenced by rust and time. The elders said the bell had not rung for 3 generations, not since the day it was bound by oath. It was not a bell to summon the faithful or to mark the passing of the hours. It was a bell of warning, a bell to wake the old watchers in the mountains, beings long forgotten by the city lords and kings but still remembered in Eld Hollow's fading chants. To ring the bell was to invite something ancient, something that would answer, though its price would always be steep. Lord Edrin, the last noble of Eld Hollow, was a man whose hair had grown white before its time, not from age but from burden. His people had begun to starve. The stores, carefully measured in autumn, were gone by the 2nd month of the freeze. Hunting parties returned with hollow eyes and empty sleds. The snow buried the roads to the south, and messengers sent to the next holdfast never returned. The youngest and oldest of Eld Hollow had already begun to fall, claimed by cold and hunger. It was in this silence, this suffocating despair, that the council came to Lord Edrin and whispered of the bell. The old bell tower was forbidden, a place the children feared, its dark wood crawling with moss and ice. Yet the stories remained, of winters so brutal that the people had once dared to ring the bell, calling upon the old watchers to save them. The price was always blood, always something precious, but the people had survived. Lord Edrin listened to the council's words and heard in their pleas the weight of his ancestors. He had no heir, no wife, no family remaining but his people. He knew the price the bell would ask could only be answered by him. At dawn, Lord Edrin climbed the creaking tower alone, his cloak heavy with frost, his gloves stiff upon the rope. Beneath him, the villagers gathered in silent prayer, their breath rising in misty columns to the sky. He grasped the rope, worn and cracked, and pulled. The bell's voice shattered the morning air, deep and hollow, a sound that seemed to wake the very bones of the mountains. It rang once, twice, a 3rd time. The sound echoed beyond the village, carried by the wind into the forests, into the frozen passes, into places men had long abandoned. That night the watcher came. It arrived with the blizzard, a figure draped in black furs, its face hidden behind a mask of bone carved in the likeness of a stag. Its hands were long, tipped with claws black as river stones, its breath steaming in the cold. The villagers cowered in their homes, but Lord Edrin met the watcher in the square, where the bell's sound still hung like a ghost between the stones. The watcher spoke not in words but in the crackling of ice, the rustling of dead leaves. Yet Edrin understood. The watcher offered what the village needed: food, warmth, the breaking of the snow's relentless grip. The rivers would flow again. The forests would yield game. The roads would clear. Eld Hollow would live. But the watcher's price was not gold nor land. The watcher demanded memory. For Eld Hollow to survive, its people would have to forget. The bell, the watchers, the ancient pacts, everything that had once bound them to the old ways would be taken. The stories would be stripped from their hearts, the names erased from their tongues. It would be as if the watchers had never been, as if the bell had never rung. Lord Edrin asked what would happen if they refused. The watcher's silence answered more clearly than words ever could. Edrin accepted. The watcher placed a clawed hand upon his chest, and in that moment, something inside him unraveled. His memories of his mother's lullabies, of his father's tales by the fire, of the first stories he had ever heard, all vanished like breath upon the wind. He remembered his people. He remembered the hunger. But the shape of the stories that had guided his house for generations was gone. The watcher's bargain was sealed. By morning, the snow had stopped. The sun, weak but certain, broke through the clouds. Rivers cracked and began to flow. The hunters found deer in the woods and fish beneath the thawing ice. Caravans from the south forced their way through the softening drifts. The famine ended. The people of Eld Hollow rejoiced, their voices lifted not in the old chants, but in relief and gratitude. Yet when they asked Lord Edrin why the snows had broken, Why salvation had arrived after so many months, he could not answer. The bell tower stood silent, the rope frayed and dusted with snow, but none remembered why it was there. The villagers avoided it out of habit, a caution that clung to them though they knew not its root. Years passed, and Lord Edrin ruled wisely, though he grew quiet in his age. The memory of the bell's sound had faded from all but him. He alone walked sometimes to the base of the tower, placing a hand upon its cold beams, feeling a hollow absence where stories should have been. The watcher never returned, its price fully paid. Eldhallow prospered, but the old names, the old ways, the echoes of the watchers were gone, dissolved into silence. The village grew, rebuilt, but a strange emptiness lingered, like a book with missing pages. On the day of his death, Lord Edrin asked to be buried beneath the bell tower, though none understood why. As the earth closed over him, the bell above swayed gently in the spring wind, though no one had touched it, though the rope had long since rotted away. And if, on certain cold mornings, the faintest echo of a bell could still be heard upon the high mountain wind, no one in Eldhallow remembered what it meant, nor why the sound stirred something ancient in their bones. The memory was gone, but the price was paid. Story 8. The Siege Beneath the Snow. The winter that swallowed Greyholt was not born of the skies but from war, a siege buried beneath snow so deep it seemed the heavens themselves had turned their backs on the earth. Greyholt, a fortress city carved from the mountainside, had withstood armies, plagues, and droughts for generations, its stone walls rising like the ribs of the mountain itself. But no stone could keep out the creeping hands of famine and frost when the snows sealed the passes and the enemy ringed the gates. It was a winter with two sieges, the soldiers beyond the walls and the cold within them. Neither would yield, and neither would relent. Lord Commander Roderick of Greyholt had thought himself prepared. He had counted the grain, salted the meat, stocked the cellars with firewood, and ordered the cisterns filled before the snowfalls came. Yet even the most cautious could not have foreseen the depth of this winter, nor the stubbornness of the Duke of Pharaoh's army camped in the valleys below. The war between them, which had begun over borders and coin, had now become a war of patience, fought not with swords but with empty bellies and frozen hands. The snow fell without pause, a thick white curtain that erased the roads, buried the enemy's camp, and forced the world to hold its breath. Greyholt's gates remained closed, its towers wrapped in frost, and its people gathered in the echoing halls, waiting, fearing, whispering. Each day the rations shrank. The bakers stretched the flour with sawdust and bitter roots. The butchers carved meat from animals long past their time. Firewood became more precious than silver. Smoke no longer rose from the hearths of the outer houses. Those homes had been stripped of their beams and furniture to keep the central keep alight. Within the high tower, Commander Roderick pored over his dwindling maps and shorter lists of supplies, his breath misting in the cold air. His hands, once steady as iron, trembled now, not from age but from hunger and the weight of decisions that gnawed at his soul. His scribe, young Edric, brought him the daily counts: how many had fallen to fever, how many to the cold, how many to their own despair. There were numbers Roderick could not bear to see. Numbers that did not bleed but still killed. The enemy outside suffered as well. Scouts reported that the Duke's army burned its own siege ladders to survive the storms, that deserters vanished into the white, that the soldiers too fell to the cold. Yet they remained. They did not break their siege. Their patience was like the snow, silent, relentless, deadly. And so Greyholt and its enemies sat in frozen silence, each daring the other to outlast winter. Among Roderick's captains, whispers grew. Some urged a sally, one desperate charge to break the enemy lines, to scatter the frozen camps, to perhaps seize enough supplies to last until the thaw. Others advised total retreat, abandoning Greyholt to its fate, fleeing through secret tunnels carved beneath the mountains, though such a road would surely claim many in the snow. Roderick heard them all, but his heart remained chained to his duty. Greyholt must stand. To abandon it would be to lose more than stone. It would be to lose their memory, their place, their name. As the siege dragged into the third month of winter, the people's eyes hollowed, their skin pale beneath the soot and grime. The fires in the temple were extinguished, the statues cold as the dead. Children's laughter vanished, replaced by the thin coughing of the sick. Roderick ordered the last reserves of grain distributed, though his captains warned him it would not last another fortnight. He gave his share to the infirmary. His men watched him with admiration but also with fear. He was preparing for the end. One bitter morning, a boy was brought before him, a messenger from the enemy, pale and shivering, holding a sealed letter with a trembling hand. The Duke of Pharaoh offered terms: surrender the keep, yield the banners, and the people would be spared. Roderick burned the letter in the brazier without reading it aloud. "If they wish our walls," he said, "they must take them stone by stone." But that same night, something changed. The snows eased, the winds calmed, and from the south, the faint sound of horns was carried on the cold air. A rescue force, long thought trapped by the winter, had broken through the lower passes. They came with wagons of grain, with firewood, with reinforcements, with the warmth of spring at their backs. The Duke's army, exhausted and frostbitten, broke like ice beneath a hammer, retreating into the night, their siege shattered not by sword but by the turning of the season. The people of Greyholt staggered to the walls, tears freezing on their cheeks, watching their enemy flee and their salvation crest the hills. Commander Roderick, gaunt and hollow-eyed, remained upon the high tower, his hands braced against the stone, his knees nearly buckling beneath him. The siege had been lifted, but the scars remained, the empty halls, the ash-filled hearths, the memory of silent hunger. Greyholt survived, not because its walls were strong, but because its people refused to fall. The story of the siege beneath the snow passed into legend, a tale of quiet endurance, of the winter that had tried to bury them, of the enemy who could not outlast the cold, and of a commander who would not abandon his post. In later years, when the walls were repaired and the fires burned bright again, the people carved a simple line into the southern gate, where Roderick had first stood to face the siege. It read, "Stone may break, snow may fall, but Greyholt stands." And long after Roderick's bones rested beneath the mountain, the gate still stood, worn by wind and time, but the words remained. Story 9. The Frozen Pilgrimage of Alric Grey. The winter that blanketed the kingdom of Valor was said to be sent by the gods themselves, a punishment, a reckoning, a season where prayers froze in the mouths of the faithful and the fires of mighty halls flickered like dying stars. It was a winter not of mere snow but of silence, a quiet that crept through forests, across fields, and into the hearts of those who dared to dream of spring. It was during this cruel season that Alric Grey, a humble stonemason, began his pilgrimage, a journey not of conquest nor glory, but one of impossible devotion, carved in frost and stone, a path that would become legend long after his name was forgotten. Alric was not a warrior nor a lord. His hands bore the calluses of years spent shaping stone, building chapels, bridges, and hearths that would stand long after he was gone. Yet when the great famine swept through the northern villages and the cold gnawed at the bones of the weak, Alric found no warmth in his chisels nor comfort in his trade. His wife, Lyra, had succumbed to the fever that stalked the frozen streets, and his daughter's final breath had risen like mist above a bed of straw. Grief hollowed him, left him adrift in a world painted in shades of white and gray. It was said that high in the frozen reaches, atop the shrouded spire, there stood an ancient shrine to Altharion, the god of cycles, the one who could bring the turning of seasons, who could end winters not measured by the sun but by sorrow. The shrine had been abandoned for centuries, its paths lost beneath avalanches and drifts that devoured entire forests. The priests claimed that no man could reach it, not through snow this deep, not when the world itself seemed to resist each step forward. But Alric, with nothing left to lose and a prayer frozen in his throat, set out alone. He left behind his tools and carried only a simple wooden staff, a fur-lined cloak, and a pouch of Black River stones, tokens of his craft, reminders of what his hands had built and what they had lost. The people of his village watched him depart in silence, believing they would never see him again, that the snow would claim him as it had claimed so many. But Alric did not fear the snow. He feared only that he would remain frozen in grief forever, that the winter inside him would never break. The journey was merciless. The snows buried the trails, the winds lashed at his face, and the forests offered no shelter, their bare branches clattering like brittle bones in the wind. Days bled into nights without clear boundary, and the cold gnawed at his flesh until his hands cracked and his breath rattled in his chest like stones in a jar. Yet he pressed on. When the path vanished beneath the drifts, he carved steps with his staff. When his firewood dwindled, he burned the wooden handle of his own satchel. Hunger clawed at him, yet he spared even the thinnest scraps for the birds that followed him in the white silence. Along the way, Alric found the bones of those who had come before him. Pilgrims, hunters, soldiers, all claimed by the same cold he now challenged. He paused at each cairn he encountered, stacking stones upon their frozen graves, a ritual born from his trade, a final act of kindness for those the snow had buried. Each cairn, though simple, marked a promise that someone had once dared to walk this path. As Alric climbed higher into the shrouded spire, the storms thickened, and the cold became a living thing, whispering in the winds, pressing against his shoulders, urging him to turn back, to surrender. His fingers stiffened, his steps slowed, yet he did not falter. The memory of Lyra's laughter, his daughter's songs, echoed in his ears, warmer than the fire he could no longer light. He carried their memory like a shield against the frost. On the 14th day, delirious and near collapse, Alric stumbled upon the remnants of an ancient stone bridge, its arch crumbling but still passable. Beyond it, the shrine rose from the mountain's crown, a temple of pale stone wreathed in ice. The gods had not kept it hidden, but they had made the road to it nearly impossible. Inside the shrine, the cold was absolute, but Alric fell to his knees before the altar, his breath shallow, his limbs numb. He whispered no grand prayer, only a simple plea, that the winter break, that no more fathers bury their daughters, that no more homes grow silent beneath the weight of snow. It is said that in that moment, the silence of the shrine shifted. The winds outside softened. A single crack echoed through the distant valleys, the sound of ice breaking, of rivers beginning to flow once more. Alric collapsed there, his final breath misting over the stone he had traveled so far to find. His body, they say, remained seated in quiet reverence, frozen in place, his journey complete. When spring returned to Valor, it came with a suddenness that startled the kingdom. The snow melted with uncommon speed. Rivers surged. Trees budded. The famine eased as the forests and fields returned to life. Villagers spoke of the lone man who had walked into the mountains and never returned, and though few knew his name, the story of his pilgrimage passed from hearth to hearth. Years later, when a band of monks braved the path to the shrouded spire, they found Alric still seated at the altar, his face peaceful, his hands resting upon his lap. Around him, birds had nested within the shrine's rafters, untouched by the cold, as if life itself had returned to that forgotten place. The monks built a cairn over his resting place, and upon its highest stone, they carved these words: "For those who walk alone, for those who pray in silence, for those who dare the winter, he walked for us." The people of Valor would remember the frozen pilgrimage not as the tale of a hero, but as the quiet testament of a man who faced the cold, not to save himself, but to carry a prayer to the highest stones of the world. And though no one could say for certain whether the gods had heard him, the rivers that followed, the harvests that bloomed, and the winters that softened seemed to whisper that perhaps they had. Story last, the silent oath of Frostmere. The winter that smothered Frostmere arrived like a shadow no flame could chase, a cold so profound it sank into the marrow of stone and bone alike. For centuries, the fortress of Frostmere had guarded the northern frontier, its black walls standing firm against barbarian raids, its watchfires burning proudly against the endless sky. But no invader, no sword, no siege tower had ever achieved what this winter now threatened: to bring the fortress to its knees, to bury its name beneath layers of unrelenting snow and silence. The snowfall began early, choking the high passes and sealing the valley roads before the last harvest could be brought in. The forests yielded no game, their creatures long fled or frozen in their dens. The wind howled through the narrow streets of the fortress like some ancient beast, rattling shutters, stealing warmth, and carrying with it a biting scent of something final. The Lord of Frostmere, Lady Sigrun, a woman of iron will and colder resolve, quickly realized that this was no ordinary season. This winter had come to test them, to find the cracks in stone and spirit alike. Within the great hall, the dwindling stores of grain and salted fish were measured with precision. Fires were rationed, warmth given first to the sick and the young, though many chose to sleep beside cold stones rather than rob their neighbors of another ember. Even the soldiers, hardened men who had spent lifetimes at the edge of war, whispered uneasily about the depths of the cold. They spoke of the icebound oath, a legend as old as Frostmere itself, a pact sworn long ago with ancient forces, bound by a bell that had not been rung in living memory, a bell that promised salvation in exchange for silence. It was said that once, when the first stones of Frostmere were laid, a winter much like this one threatened to devour the fledgling fortress. In desperation, the ancestors of Lady Sigrun rang the iron bell of silence, calling upon the frostbound, the faceless spirits who ruled the deep cold. The frostbound answered, sparing Frostmere, but the price was steep. They demanded an oath, that the bell would never be rung again, that the fortress would endure its winters in silence, no matter the suffering. To break the oath would invite a cold far worse than death, a cold that would not thaw, even in the heart of summer. The bell still hung in the tower, its iron blackened by centuries of frost, its rope long rotted away. None dared to touch it. None spoke of it in earnest. But as the winter dragged on, as the people grew gaunt and hollow-eyed, as the fires dimmed to cinders, the whispers grew louder. Some begged Lady Sigrun to ring the bell, to call upon the frostbound again. Others warned her that such a breach would doom them all. Lady Sigrun chose silence. She walked the ramparts each morning, her boots crunching over snow, her breath thick in the air, her gaze hard as the stones beneath her. She rationed the food with ruthless discipline, giving herself the smallest portions. She ordered desperate hunts into the white forests, though the men returned with little more than pine bark and withered roots. When some began to flee into the storm in madness, chasing visions of warmth that did not exist, she tightened the gates, posted guards, and held fast. But winter did not relent. It deepened. The children's laughter disappeared from the halls. The chapel's fires died. The sick grew silent, their bodies wrapped and carried out into the snow. Sigrun's captains begged her again to ring the bell. They spoke of duty, of the lives she could still save. The fortress teetered on the edge of collapse. But Sigrun remembered the oath, carved into the base of the bell tower itself. Endure the storm. Trust the stone. Speak not the bell's name. She knew the price would be more than they could bear. Her final hope lay in the return of the supply caravan from Erwin Hold to the south. They had sent word months before, pleading for grain, firewood, anything. But the caravan had not come. Despair loomed like the snow-packed sky. And yet, Sigrun refused. She clung to the oath as fiercely as she clung to her sword. Then, on the eve of the solstice, a horn sounded on the southern road. Against all odds, the supply caravan had broken through the drifts, guided by a band of rangers who had nearly perished in the attempt. They brought grain, salted meats, dried fruits, oil for the lamps, and enough firewood to revive the long-dead hearths. The fortress erupted in exhausted joy. Frostmere had survived. The people cheered Lady Sigrun, hailing her as the Iron Flame, the lady who outlasted winter. Yet few noticed her distant gaze as she stood upon the battlements, staring toward the bell tower, her gloved hand resting on the hilt of her sword. The choice she had made, enduring without calling upon forbidden powers, had saved them, but she knew how close she had come to surrendering to the temptation. Some nights, she would still walk the tower stairs alone, pausing at the iron bell that hung in silence. She would trace the edge of its rim with her fingertips, feeling the frost bite through her gloves. She never rang it. She never spoke its name. But she understood the weight of it now, not just as a relic, but as a promise carved into the very bones of her people. In the years that followed, bards sang of the winter of silence, of the lady who refused to break the oath. Frostmere rebuilt, its fires burned brighter, but the story of that season lingered like frost upon stone. A story not of magic or intervention, but of endurance, discipline, and the quiet strength to hold to a promise when all seemed lost. long after Sigrun's time, when new lords ruled Frostmere, when the winters softened and the bells in other cities rang freely, the iron bell of silence still hung untouched, wrapped in layers of frost. And though the people no longer feared it as they once did, they left it alone, a monument to a winter that nearly consumed them, and to the woman who chose silence over surrender. Story first, The Winter of Eldenwood, a medieval tale for sleep. In the quiet heart of the kingdom of Eldenwood, where the great oaks whispered ancient secrets and the stone cottages huddled beneath thick blankets of snow, winter had arrived in its full, majestic silence. The year was 1274, a time when knights roamed the cobbled roads, monks transcribed holy texts by candlelight, and the crackling hearth was the center of every home. It was in this serene yet formidable winter that our story begins, a story meant not of battles, but of peace, of slow days and gentle nights, of simple lives carried along by the rhythm of the season. The first snow had fallen with the quiet grace of feathers, layering the rooftops and winding lanes of the village. The chimneys exhaled soft plumes of smoke into the silver sky as the villagers settled into the long sleep of winter. In Eldenwood, winter was not feared but embraced, a time for storytelling, for resting tired hands, for tending the animals and sharing stews rich with root vegetables and the last of the autumn's meat. Among the villagers was a kindly old man named Alaric, whose snowy beard matched the fields that stretched endlessly beyond the village gates. Alaric was known not for his strength or wealth, but for his stories, tales that drifted through the tavern like the soft notes of a lute, calming even the most restless of souls. On these winter nights, when the wind sang through the cracks in the timber and the darkness wrapped around the stone walls like a thick cloak, the villagers would gather around Alaric's hearth, their cheeks flushed from the cold, their hands cupped around wooden bowls of warm broth. Alaric's cottage was small, its roof sagging beneath the weight of the snow, but within, it glowed with the gentle flicker of the fire. The walls were lined with bundles of dried herbs, their subtle fragrance mingling with the scent of burning pine. The floor creaked softly as his old hound, Bryn, circled thrice before settling by the hearth, his tail thumping slowly in contentment. "Come, my friends," Alaric would say in his warm, low voice as he ladled broth into waiting bowls. "Let me tell you of winter's long past, of kings and commoners, of quiet courage and steadfast hearts." And so, the stories would unfold like frost patterns on glass, intricate, beautiful, and fleeting. One winter, many years before, the village had faced a snowstorm so fierce it sealed the gates shut for a fortnight. The snow piled high against the doors, the winds howled like restless spirits, and yet, the people endured. They shared what little they had, their bread and salted fish, their firewood and woolen blankets. It was not a time of glory, but of quiet kindness, of neighbor tending to neighbor, of laughter shared over sparse meals. Alaric's voice would soften as he spoke of the Lady Eleonora, the gentle healer who once roamed the village with her satchel of herbs, her fingers stained with the green of tinctures and the deep reds of crushed berries. She braved the cold to visit the sick, her lantern a tiny star in the endless white. Her story, like many of Alaric's tales, was not carved in stone nor sung by minstrels, but it lived in the hearts of the people who remembered the warmth of her touch on their fevered brows. As the fire cracked and the snow tapped gently against the shutters, the villagers would listen, their eyes growing heavy, their breathing slow. The rhythm of Alaric's words, steady and calm, wove a soft cocoon around them, a shelter against the winter's chill. Beyond the village, the castle of Eldenwood stood like a sentinel, its towers dusted with snow, its halls echoing with the slow footfalls of knights wrapped in furs. Even the great halls, so often filled with the clamor of feasts and the ring of goblets, were subdued in winter. Fires roared in the stone hearths, tapestries hung heavy on the walls, and the lords and ladies moved at an unhurried pace, their days filled with the turning of pages, the sipping of mulled wine, the tending of falcons resting in the mews. It was said that King Aldred himself would walk the castle grounds, his breath misting in the cold, his mind wandering to days gone by. He found solace in the stillness of winter, where the duties of kingship softened beneath the hush of falling snow. Alaric's tales reached even to the royal ears, for the king's steward would visit the village to hear these stories and carry them back to the castle halls. The king, in his twilight years, found comfort in the simple lives of his people, their quiet bravery in the face of winter's long grasp. As each night passed, the villagers found peace in the repetition of Alaric's stories, the tales of young blacksmiths forging horseshoes in the pale morning light, of shepherds who sang to their flocks beneath the snow-laden boughs, of children sliding down the frozen hills, their laughter carrying like bells through the crisp air. The passing days were marked not by great events but by small, cherished moments. The gathering of firewood, the mending of cloaks, the careful tending of the village well so it would not freeze over. Life in Eldenwood was steady, deliberate, like the slow drip of icicles melting in the brief afternoon sun. On some nights, Alaric would speak of the ancient forests beyond the village, where great elk roamed and the silence was so deep it felt as though time itself had paused. He told of the old stone paths, long forgotten beneath the snow, of moss-covered ruins that whispered of a time before kings and villages. "Do you hear it?" he would ask, his voice a low murmur. "The snow speaks, if you listen. It tells of the ones who came before, of their footsteps now hidden beneath the white. It remembers always." And so, the villagers would drift to sleep with these gentle tales in their ears, their dreams filled with snow-covered forests, the soft clink of a blacksmith's hammer, the golden flicker of hearth flames. The winter in Eldenwood was not just a season, it was a living story, a time when the world slowed, when hearts turned inward, when the simple threads of daily life wove together into a warm, enduring tapestry. As the months wore on, the days stretched a little longer, the sun climbed a little higher, and the snow began to melt into rivulets that whispered through the cobblestones. But even as spring approached, the memories of winter lingered like the last embers of a dying fire. Alaric would sit by his hearth, his old hound resting at his feet, and he would watch as the village slowly awakened from its long slumber. The stories he told would live on, passed from tongue to tongue, a gentle melody echoing through generations. For in Eldenwood, it was known that winter's tales were not just for passing the dark nights. They were the heartbeat of the village, the quiet thread that held them all together. And so, as you close your eyes and let the calm of this medieval winter wash over you, remember the soft hush of falling snow, the warm glow of the hearth, and the soothing cadence of Alaric's stories, a timeless comfort, a peaceful lullaby carried on the wind. Rest now, traveler. Let the snow fall quietly. Let the village of Eldenwood watch over you in your dreams. Story 2. The Silent Winter of Avemore, a medieval tale for sleep. In the distant northern reaches of the medieval kingdom, where the days were short and the nights stretched like endless ribbons of velvet, there lay the quiet village of Avemore. Winter had settled over the land like a thick, downy quilt, softening the edges of every stone wall and every thatched roof. Snow clung to the tall pines that stood like sentinels at the village borders, their branches heavy with the weight of the season. Time moved differently here. Slowly, gently, as if the world itself had decided to pause and simply breathe beneath the hush of the falling snow. It is here that our second story begins. Avemore was a place untouched by the clang of swords or the roar of armies. It was a village where life unfolded in quiet circles, the tending of sheep, the weaving of wool, the soft rhythm of wooden looms, and the simple joy of warm bread shared at twilight. In Avemore, winter was not a season to conquer. It was a companion, one that walked alongside the villagers, wrapping them in cold arms and urging them to draw closer to the fire. The people of Avemore embraced the stillness of the season. They knew that winter was not just snow and ice. It was the time for stories, for rest, for listening to the wind as it sighed through the eaves and carried whispers from the distant mountains. At the center of the village stood the old stone hall, its timbers worn but strong, its hearth forever burning through the long months of frost. Here, every evening, the villagers gathered to sit upon wooden benches, wrapped in woolen cloaks, their faces flushed from the brisk air. The hall smelled of pine, of baked rye bread, and the faint tang of wood smoke that clung to every garment. It was in this hall that the gentlewoman Iseldra would spin her tales, stories older than the stones, stories passed from grandmother to mother to child. Iseldra was neither noble nor poor, neither young nor truly old, yet she carried the weight of generations in her voice, soft and steady as falling snow. Her hair, silver as frost, was always tied beneath a linen cap, and her pale blue eyes glimmered like the icy streams that slumbered beneath their frozen covers. "Sit close," she would begin, her hands folded in her lap, her voice no louder than a breath. "Tonight, I will tell you the tale of the Winter Watcher." The villagers would lean in, their cups of spiced cider warming their fingers, the fire's gentle crackle lulling them into the calm rhythm of the night. Iseldra spoke of a time when the snows first began to fall, centuries past, when the mountains that now guarded Avemore had yet to take their present shape. She told of a solitary figure, wrapped in cloaks of gray and white, who walked the forests and fields each winter, watching over the land as the world slept beneath its frozen veil. This Winter Watcher, she said, was not a spirit to be feared but one to be respected, for he guarded the silence of the season, ensuring that no harm came to those who honored the slowness of winter. The story was not one of grand quests or battles, but of a shepherd boy named Tomas, who once followed the Watcher's distant footprints deep into the snow-laden woods. Tomas did not seek riches or glory, he sought only to understand why the Watcher moved in solitude and why his path always circled the village without ever entering. Through the soft hush of snow, through frozen streams and silent groves, Tomas followed, his breath misting in the cold air, his boots sinking into the deep drifts. 4 days and nights, he walked, guided by the delicate imprint of the Watcher's steps, until he found the Watcher resting beneath an ancient pine, its limbs sagging under centuries of snowfall. The Watcher, Iseldra said, welcomed Tomas with quiet eyes and a nod, and in the silence between them, the boy understood. The Watcher was the keeper of winter's peace. He carried the weight of the still season, ensuring the world slowed when it needed to rest. It was his task to protect the sacred quiet, to guard the soft spaces where life could catch its breath. Tomas returned to Avemore changed, not with treasures, but with a deep understanding of the season's purpose. He told no one of the Watcher's face, only of his task, and from then on, the village honored the quiet of winter. They embraced its stillness, they walked softly upon the snow, they sang their songs in low, gentle tones so as not to disturb the calm that blanketed their world. Iseldra's voice would trail off, like a breeze fading into the trees, and the hall would fall into a peaceful silence. The villagers would sip their cider, their minds painted with the images of silver forests and the steady footsteps of the Winter Watcher. The days in Avemore passed with a soft rhythm. The blacksmith's hammer rang only in the brief midday light, the weavers plied their trade with deliberate patience, and the children played quietly beneath the watchful eye of the snow-covered trees. Even the village dogs, their thick coats dusted with frost, moved with an unhurried grace, as if they too understood the gentle pace of winter. Each morning, the village baker would rise before the pale sun and knead his dough with calm hands, the warmth of his oven offering comfort against the bite of the morning air. His loaves, crusty and golden, were shared freely among the villagers, a small kindness that bound them together. The village healer, Mira, would walk carefully from cottage to cottage, her basket of dried lavender and healing salves tucked beneath her woolen shawl. Her knock was never rushed, her words always soft. She knew that in winter, time did not chase, but patiently waited. At dusk, the snow would glow faintly under the lavender hues of the sky, and the people would return to the hall, to hear Iseldra's voice, to share quiet laughter, and to feel the steady warmth of the hearth as the cold deepened outside. One evening, as the snow whispered against the windows and the flames danced lazily in the hearth, Iseldra shared a final tale, one that the villagers would remember long after the snow had melted from the fields. She spoke of the first spring that had come to Avemore, the first melt after a winter that had lingered longer than most. The streams had begun to trickle once more, the buds had begun to swell upon the bare branches, and the people had emerged into the pale sunlight with cautious hope. Yet as the village stirred from its long sleep, the Winter Watcher's footprints were found circling the village one last time, a gentle reminder that though winter had passed, its spirit would return again, to guide them into stillness once more. "Remember," Iseldra whispered, her voice softer than the snow, "winter is not a season to flee from, but a companion to walk beside. It teaches us to rest, to listen, to move with care. It guards the spaces where we learn to be still." The villagers of Avemore, with hearts full of quiet reverence, would carry these stories into their dreams. They would remember the weight of the snow upon their shoulders, the warm press of wool against their skin, the slow, rhythmic days that asked for nothing but patience. And as you rest now, breathing softly, perhaps you too can feel the peace of Avamor's winter, the calm that drapes itself over the world like a gentle quilt, the steady heartbeat of a season that asks only that you slow, that you listen, that you find comfort in the quiet. The snow falls still. The hearth glows warmly. The stories remain, like soft echoes in the night. Rest now, traveler. Let the village of Avamor watch over you, in your slumber, in your dreams. Story 3. The Winter Bells of Thornwick, a medieval tale for sleep. In a time long past, when the snow would fall for months without end, and the nights lingered like long, velvet curtains drawn across the sky, there stood the quiet town of Thornwick, cradled between white-tipped hills and ancient stone roads. The winter there was not just a season, it was a way of life, a gentle rhythm that guided the people through each day and each night with slow, deliberate steps. The story begins as all winters in Thornwick began, with the soft tolling of the bells. Each year, as the first snowflakes began to fall, the bells of the great stone abbey would ring out across the silent fields, their deep, mellow tones drifting through the cold air like a soft invitation to rest. The bells did not call for urgency, nor for battle, nor for haste. They called for quiet. They called for peace. They called for winter to come and stay a while. In the village square, the people would gather to light their lanterns and watch as the snow slowly blanketed the cobblestones in white. Shopkeepers would shutter their windows, shepherds would lead their flocks into warm barns, and the children would press their faces to the glass, waiting for the first story of the season. For in Thornwick, winter was the season of stories. And no storyteller was more beloved than the abbey's bellkeeper, an old man named Brother Aldwin. Brother Aldwin had tended the bells for more winters than most could remember. His beard, white as the snow, brushed the collar of his thick woolen robe, and his hands, though gnarled with age, moved with the gentle precision of one who had spent a lifetime coaxing music from cold iron. Each evening, as the last embers in the hearths flickered low, the people would gather in the abbey hall, where Aldwin would sit by the grand window that overlooked the snowy hills. There, with a blanket across his knees and a cup of honey tea in his hands, he would begin to speak in a voice as soft as freshly fallen snow. "Come closer, my friends," he would say, his eyes kind and his voice slow. "Tonight, I will tell you the story of the winter bells." The winter bells, he explained, were not ordinary bells. They were ancient, cast by hands now long forgotten, their tones crafted not to summon, but to soothe. It was said that the bells could calm the fiercest storms, that their sound could coax restless hearts into peace. They were the guardians of winter's silence. Long ago, in the age when the forests were thicker and the skies were darker, a terrible winter had fallen upon the land. The snow came so fast, the winds so fierce, that whole villages disappeared beneath the drifts. The rivers froze solid, and the sun seemed to vanish from the sky. The people despaired, for no fire could warm them, and no food could be found. In the midst of this deep winter, a young monk named Eamon had climbed the tallest tower of Thornwick's Abbey, where the bells lay cold and silent. Though the other monks had sought shelter in their stone cells, Eamon believed the bells could bring comfort to the frightened souls of the village. With trembling hands and breath thick as mist, Eamon rang the bells. The sound, sweet and low, rolled over the frozen hills like a gentle blanket, settling over the rooftops, slipping beneath doorways, and curling into the hearts of those who listened. And something extraordinary happened. The winds, though still cold, began to soften. The snow, though still falling, seemed to hush its fierce descent. The people, wrapped in their cloaks and their worry, felt their hearts steady. They came together, sharing what little they had, singing softly, waiting for spring. It was not that the bells stopped the snow, Aldwin would remind them. It was that the bells reminded the people to be still, to be kind, to be patient in the long season. The bells became the heartbeat of Thornwick. And to this day, Aldwin told them, the bells must be rung each winter to carry their song across the snow. As Aldwin's voice would drift across the abbey hall, the villagers would lean closer, their breathing slow, their thoughts filled with the sound of those distant, comforting bells. Each morning in Thornwick began with soft tasks. The bakers would rise early to knead their dough by lantern light, their warm ovens offering solace against the chill. The blacksmith's forge would glow dimly in the pale hours, but his hammer rang quietly now, for winter did not rush. The shepherds would lead their woolly flocks to sheltered meadows, and the weavers would spin their yarn with steady hands by the window's weak light. The days passed not in haste, but in peaceful rhythm. The children would build small forts of snow and toss handfuls of soft powder into the air, their giggles muffled by woolen scarves. The village dogs, their noses dusted with frost, would chase the falling snowflakes, their tails wagging in slow, happy beats. At midday, the townsfolk would gather near the square's great fir tree, where Aldwin would gently ring the smallest of the bells, its soft chimes signaling the hour of rest. They would sip their broths, share their crusty bread, and speak in quiet tones, their words as gentle as the falling snow. But it was in the evenings that Thornwick truly came alive, not with noise, but with calm togetherness. The abbey's great hearth would roar to life, the stone walls warm with its golden glow, and Aldwin would begin another story. One evening, as the snow drifted lazily outside and the village lay blanketed in serene white, Aldwin shared a tale that had been passed to him from his own master. He spoke of the silent night, a traveler who wandered the winter roads not in search of battle or fame, but in search of quiet places where his presence could bring peace. The knight, clad not in shining armor, but in simple woolen garb, carried no sword, only a small bell tied to his staff. Wherever he went, he listened. He listened to the wind, to the trees, to the hearts of those he met. When he found places of unrest, he would ring his bell just once, a soft, silver chime that seemed to settle the world around him. In time, the silent night became part of Thornwick's legend, a symbol of the peace that winter could bring if only one chose to move slowly, to speak gently, to listen with care. Aldwin would pause after this story, his fingers wrapped around his tea, his eyes glimmering with the memory of tales told and retold. The villagers would leave the abbey that night walking slowly, their boots pressing softly into the snow, their hearts light, their breathing calm. And so the days continued, each marked by the ringing of the bells, each evening softened by the sound of Aldwin's stories. When the first signs of spring finally crept into Thornwick, the drip of melting icicles, the tentative blooming of early crocuses, the bells would ring their final winter note. It was not a sound of farewell, but a gentle promise that the peace of the season would return again. Brother Aldwin, now content in his many years, would sit by the window one last time, watching as the snow slowly gave way to green, knowing his stories would carry on, whispered by the wind, remembered by the bells. And perhaps, as you rest now, you too can hear them, the soft chime of the winter bells of Thornwick, carrying through the cold air, steady and warm, asking only that you slow, that you breathe, that you find comfort in the quiet of this medieval winter. Let the snow fall. Let the bells ring. Let your thoughts drift gently into rest. Sleep well, traveler. Thornwick watches over you now. Story 4. The Winter Lanterns of Greymoor, a medieval tale for sleep. In the far western valleys, where the winding rivers slumbered beneath a cover of thick ice and the mountain ridges stood like ancient stone guardians, there was a small, snowbound village called Greymoor. It was a place where winters lingered longer than in any other corner of the kingdom. The sky often wore a cloak of soft gray, and the snow, which fell as fine as sifted flour, coated every path, every roof, and every tree, settling over the village like a quiet promise of rest. And it is here, in this peaceful, slow-moving village, that our fourth story begins. Greymoor was not known for its wealth or its grandeur. It was known for its calm, its patience, and its most cherished tradition, the lighting of the winter lanterns. Every year, as the frost began to settle and the last of the autumn leaves disappeared beneath the snow, the people of Greymoor prepared for the longest night, a time when the sun would set early and not return until many hours had passed. The villagers would craft delicate lanterns from oiled parchment and soft pine wood frames, tying them with silver thread and adorning them with tiny bells that chimed gently in the winter wind. The lanterns were not merely decorations. They were symbols of quiet resilience, small beacons of warmth glowing softly against the endless white of winter. They reminded the people to move slowly, to carry their light carefully through the dark months. At the heart of this tradition was an old lantern maker named Thomason, a kind man with weathered hands and a voice as smooth as falling snow. His shop, tucked between two stone cottages, always smelled of beeswax and cedar shavings, the scent drifting like a gentle song through the frozen streets. Thomason spent his days crafting lanterns with the utmost care, his fingers gliding over the parchment, folding and shaping each piece until it curved into a perfect globe. As the longest night approached, the villagers would visit Thomason, placing quiet orders for their lanterns. No two were ever the same. Some glowed with warm amber, others with the pale blue of distant stars, and a few with a soft, flickering silver that seemed to hum with the memory of winters long past. Thomason would greet each villager with a nod and a gentle smile. "Patience," he would say, his voice calm, "lanterns must be made slowly. The light within them needs time to settle." In Greymoor, no one hurried. The snow softened every sound, muffled every footstep. Even the village dogs trotted through the drifts with careful, deliberate steps, their noses dusted with frost, their tails wagging in slow, steady arcs. The days were filled with quiet tasks. The bakers rose early to stoke their ovens, filling the air with the rich scent of rye and barley loaves. The woodcutters, their breath misting in the cold, chopped firewood in steady rhythm, never rushed, their axes thudding softly against the grain. The weavers sat by their windows, spinning thick woolen cloaks with peaceful hands, pausing now and then to watch the snowflakes gather upon the glass. Each evening, the villagers gathered in the central square where Thomason's shop glowed like a golden ember. They would sip warm broth, wrap their cloaks tightly around their shoulders, and listen as Thomason told the story of the first winter lantern. It is said, Thomason would begin, his voice low and soothing, that long ago, before even Greymoor was built, the valley was home to the Star Wanderers, a people who followed the light of the skies. One winter, the stars vanished behind thick clouds, and the wanderers feared they would lose their way. But a young girl, whose name has been forgotten to time, crafted the first lantern, weaving thin strips of bark and lighting a small flame within. She carried her lantern through the endless snow, its soft light guiding her people, step by slow step, until spring returned. The villagers listened, their breathing slow, their hearts warmed by the flickering lanterns around them. Thomason's story was always the same, but it never grew old. The tale of the girl who carried her fragile light through the darkest winter reminded them that even in silence, even in the longest cold, there was a quiet strength in moving forward, in tending the light with patience and care. As the longest night finally arrived, the entire village gathered to light their lanterns. One by one, tiny flames flickered to life, casting a soft glow upon the snow. The bells tied to each lantern chimed gently as the villagers paraded through the streets, their footsteps light, their faces calm. There were no grand speeches, no loud celebrations, only the soft shuffle of boots upon snow, the warm hum of voices singing ancient songs passed down through generations. The lanterns, Thomason would always remind them, were not meant to fight back the dark. They were meant to accompany it, to move alongside it, to soften its edges. When the procession reached the frozen lake at the edge of the village, the people would set their lanterns upon the snow-covered shore, their flames glowing like small, steady stars against the quiet night. And then, in unspoken understanding, the villagers would stand together in silence, watching the lanterns flicker and sway in the winter breeze. In those moments, there was no need for words. The snow fell softly. The bells chimed gently. The light shimmered. Thomason, standing among them, would always offer a final whisper, more to the wind than to anyone in particular. "Carry your light slowly. Let it warm your hands. Let it guide you, step by step, through all your winters." And as the villagers turned to make their way home, their lanterns would remain behind, glowing softly until the snow eventually covered them, tucking them into the earth like a gentle farewell. The days after the longest night passed in quiet peace. The snow continued to fall, the winds continued to whisper through the trees, and life in Greymoor moved steadily onward. The bakers continued their slow, careful work. The woodcutters still moved in calm rhythm. The weavers continued to spin their wool, their fingers brushing gently against the threads as they worked. The village dogs continued to wander the streets, their paths as familiar as the quiet snow that met their paws. Thomason's lantern shop remained warm and golden, and though the longest night had passed, he continued to craft lanterns, each one holding a quiet light within. Some were meant for next winter. Some were meant to be kept, glowing softly on windowsills throughout the year, gentle reminders that the slow, steady light could accompany them in every season. And as the winter wore on, the villagers carried that light with them, in their careful steps, in their soft laughter, in the peaceful way they moved through their days. They no longer feared the long nights, for they understood that patience and quiet kindness could carry them through the coldest seasons. Perhaps now, as you rest and breathe softly, you can imagine the gentle glow of Greymoor's lanterns, their light flickering calmly against the snow, their tiny bells chiming softly in the winter air. Let the snow fall slowly. Let the lanterns burn steadily. Let the peaceful rhythm of Greymoor guide you into restful sleep. Sleep well, traveler. The lanterns will watch over you tonight. Story 5. The Winter Bridge of Eldervale. A medieval tale for sleep. In the northern hills, where the rivers flowed slow and wide, there stood the quiet village of Eldervale, a place where winter came early and lingered long, where the snow would gather thick upon the rooftops, and the morning air shimmered with soft mist. Eldervale was a village of stone cottages, winding lanes, and a bridge, an ancient stone bridge that arched gracefully over the River Wren, its surface dusted in snow, its edges softened by time. It is here, near this bridge, that our fifth winter story begins. In Eldervale, the seasons were slow, the winters long, and the people unhurried. The village did not boast of battles or riches, but was known for the way it tended to its winters, with patience, with kindness, and with stories. The most cherished story of all was the tale of the winter bridge. As the first snow began to fall, the people of Eldervale would prepare for the winter crossing, a quiet ceremony where they would gather near the stone bridge and leave small offerings of pine cones, dried herbs, and woven garlands. It was said that the bridge did not only carry people across the river, but also carried their memories, their hopes, and their dreams from one winter to the next. The bridge was cared for by an old woman named Enid, the bridge keeper. She lived in a small cottage near the river's bend, where the willows dipped their branches into the slow-moving water. Enid's days were gentle and predictable. She would sweep the snow from the bridge each morning, her broom's soft bristles whispering across the stone. She would light small lanterns along the railings, their golden glow flickering against the pale gray sky. And in the evenings, she would sit upon her bench, her hands wrapped around a wooden cup of spiced tea, and she would tell stories to those who came to visit. "Come, rest a while," she would say, her voice low and comforting. "Let me tell you the story of the winter bridge." The villagers, wrapped in thick cloaks, their breath rising in soft clouds, would gather around her. Even the village dogs, their fur dusted with snow, would curl at her feet, their tails still, their eyes heavy with calm. Enid would begin in her steady, soothing tone. "It is said," she would whisper, "that long ago, before Eldervale was more than a handful of cottages, the river would freeze so solid in winter that no one could cross it safely. The ice would groan and crack, and many feared to venture across. One winter, when the snow was deep and the nights were long, a traveler came, a mason, carrying only his tools and a bundle of bread. He built a bridge, stone by stone, working slowly, carefully, through the biting cold. The villagers offered him no coin, for they had none to give, but they brought him warm broth and dry wool to ease his work. He asked for only one thing in return, that the bridge be tended, that it be kept clear of snow and lit by lanterns, so that travelers in winter would always find their way. And so, even now, we keep his promise. The winter bridge stands because it carries not only our footsteps but also our quiet care." The story was simple, but the villagers loved it. It reminded them of patience, of working steadily through winter's long grip, of building something lasting with gentle hands and careful hearts. Each morning, the people of Eldervale would pass over the bridge in peaceful procession. The baker would carry his flour sacks, the shepherd would guide his woolly flock, and the weavers would walk slowly, their baskets of yarn swinging lightly by their sides. They would nod to Enid as she swept the snow from the stones, her broom moving in quiet rhythm, her breath soft in the cold air. Life in Eldervale was slow, as it should be in winter. The fires crackled softly in stone hearths, the scent of pine and beeswax drifting lazily through the cottages. The blacksmith worked not in loud clangs but in gentle taps, shaping hinges and lantern frames with deliberate care. The village children would skate upon the frozen pond, their laughter a faint chime against the heavy hush of snow. As the days passed, Enid would share more stories, tales of travelers who found shelter in Eldervale's kindness, of distant kings who sent no messengers in winter because they knew the roads belonged to the snow. She spoke of the river's ancient spirit, who slept beneath the ice, and who was said to listen to the soft steps that crossed above him. One story the villagers remembered most. It was the tale of a winter long past, when the snows came early and stayed well beyond spring's first call. A young girl named Lyra had once crossed the bridge each morning to visit her grandmother on the far side of the river. But one day, the snow fell so thick and fast that the path disappeared, the bridge hidden beneath a deep, white blanket. Lyra, determined and unafraid, began to clear the snow with her small wooden broom, sweeping and sweeping, though the drifts were taller than she. The villagers, seeing her quiet effort, joined her. Together, they cleared the bridge, each person adding their soft footfalls to its stones, until once more, the path was safe. When Enid told this story, her voice would soften even further. The winter bridge, she would say, is not kept by one, but by many. Each step we take, each sweep of the broom, each lantern we light, we all carry the care that keeps the bridge alive. As the longest night approached, the villagers would hang new lanterns along the railings, their warm glow reflecting in the slow, glassy river below. The bells tied to the lanterns would chime softly in the breeze, their sound as gentle as snow landing on pine needles. The procession across the bridge on the longest night was slow and peaceful. The villagers would walk in silence, their lanterns swaying in their hands, their boots pressing soft prints into the snow. They would stop at the center of the bridge, listening to the silence, feeling the slow pulse of winter around them. Enid, leading the way, would light the final lantern and set it upon the highest post, where it would burn throughout the night, a quiet promise that the bridge would remain safe, that the way would remain open, no matter how deep the snow. When the people returned to their cottages, the bridge would stand quietly behind them, its stones warmed by the soft lantern light, the snow brushed gently aside, the river beneath it whispering stories to the ice. The days after the longest night unfolded slowly. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the fields and the rooftops, and the people moved through their routines with calm, steady care. The baker's bread rose in quiet ovens, the weavers spun their yarn in warm, sunlit rooms, and the blacksmith's hammer rang softly, marking time in peaceful beats. Enid, still tending the bridge each morning, found comfort in the rhythm. She knew that someday, another would take her place, another would sweep the stones, light the lanterns, and tell the stories. The winter bridge would remain, carried not by grand deeds, but by the small, kind steps of those who passed over it. And perhaps now, as you rest and let your breathing slow, you can imagine the quiet beauty of Eldervale's winter, the soft crunch of boots upon snow, the warm flicker of lanterns in the dusk, the gentle sweep of a broom against ancient stone. Let the snow continue to fall. Let the lanterns glow. Let the winter bridge carry you gently, step by steady step, into peaceful dreams. Sleep well, traveler. The bridge will guide you safely through the night. Story 6, The Silent Abbey of Frostwick, a medieval tale for sleep. In the farthest northern reaches of the kingdom, where the sky often lingered in soft gray and the earth lay buried beneath thick, untouched snow, there stood an ancient stone abbey called Frostwick. It had watched over the quiet hills and frozen lakes for centuries, its tall towers softened by time, its walls draped in long trails of winter ivy that shimmered with frost. The winters in Frostwick were long and unhurried. The snow would fall like whispers from the sky, each flake settling slowly upon the earth, covering the cobbled paths, the wooden carts, and the bare, sleeping trees. The air was crisp, but not biting, and the silence of the land was a comfort rather than a weight. It is here, within the stillness of the abbey's stone walls, that our sixth story begins. The brothers of Frostwick Abbey lived simple, peaceful lives. They rose before the pale sun, not to rush, but to walk slowly through the stone corridors, their footsteps soft upon the frost-covered floors. Their days were spent tending to the abbey's ancient gardens, even in winter, where root vegetables grew quietly beneath layers of hay and snow. They baked loaves of dark bread in wide ovens, their careful hands shaping each round with patient rhythm. They tended the small flocks of sheep and gathered firewood from the edges of the sleeping forests. In Frostwick, there were no grand processions or loud sermons. The brothers spoke little, their voices reserved for songs, for soft greetings, and for stories shared near the hearth at night. Among them was Brother Henri, the oldest of the abbey's caretakers. His beard was as white as the snowdrifts, his eyes gentle and deep with the memory of many winters. Henri was the keeper of the abbey's stories, the one who passed on the quiet history of Frostwick to each new brother who arrived. Each evening, as the snow tapped gently against the arched windows and the fire crackled in the great stone hearth, the brothers would gather to listen as Henri spoke. His voice was low, steady, and calm, a voice that moved like a soft river beneath the ice. "Come close," Henri would begin, folding his hands upon his woolen robe. "Tonight, I will tell you the story of the silent abbey." The brothers would settle on wooden benches, their bowls of warm broth cupped in their hands, their breathing slowing as Henri's words filled the hall. "It is said," Henri began, "that long, long ago, when the abbey walls were newly built and the village of Frostwick was but a cluster of cottages, the winters were harsher than they are now. The winds howled like distant wolves, and the snows came quickly, rising high against doors and walls. In those days there was a monk named Alaric, known not for his strength or his knowledge, but for his listening. While others prayed and sang loudly, Alaric would walk the snow-covered cloisters in silence, listening to the wind, to the snow, to the quiet voices of the land. One winter, when the snow had fallen without pause for many days, Alaric heard something the others could not. A faint sound beneath the snow, a soft chime that echoed through the abbey's halls. He followed the sound beyond the gates, across the fields, and toward the frozen lake where no path had been walked that season. There, upon the lake's edge, buried beneath layers of ice and drift, Alaric found a bell, small and silver, its surface worn but its tones still pure. He rang the bell gently, and the snow seemed to hush, the wind seemed to soften, and the cold, though it lingered, no longer bit so fiercely. From that day, the brothers of Frostwick honored the silence of winter. They spoke softly, they walked gently, and each evening, they rang the small silver bell to welcome the night. Henri would pause, his hands resting upon his knees, his gaze soft upon the fire. The brothers would listen to the silence between his words, feeling the calm settle around them like a warm cloak. In Frostwick, life moved slowly through winter. The brothers rose with the pale light, gathering their wooden buckets to collect water from the well, where the surface ice was carefully broken each morning. They baked their bread, folded their linen robes, and tended their sheep with quiet patience. The abbey's scriptorium, where books were carefully copied and bound, was a place of gentle work. The monks dipped their quills slowly, their ink strokes measured, their breathing even. The quiet scratch of ink upon parchment was the loudest sound, a steady rhythm that matched the falling snow outside. When the villagers from the nearby hamlets would visit, they would bring simple gifts, bundles of pine wood, jars of honey, thick skeins of wool, and in return, the brothers would offer warm broth, small loaves, and stories of winter's wisdom. The villagers would stay until evening, sitting near the hearth as Brother Henri told them more tales. One such story spoke of the winter path, a trail that was said to appear only during the deepest snows. Henri would describe it carefully, the pale line that curved between the silent trees, leading to places forgotten in the green seasons. It was said that those who walked the winter path would not find treasure, but would find peace, the kind of peace that stayed with them through all the winters of their lives. Henri would smile gently as he finished his story, the fire's glow softening his lined face. Some say the winter path is not a place, but a way of moving, a quiet step, a patient breath, a steady hand in the cold. As the nights passed, the silver bell remained a part of their rhythm. Each evening, as the snow deepened and the winds pressed against the abbey walls, Brother Henri would ring the bell, its soft chime floating across the snowy fields, a sound not to summon, but to soothe. Even the village dogs, their fur thick and their pace slow, seemed to move more gently when they heard the bell's song. The days after the longest night were no different from those before. In Frostwick, the seasons did not demand change, they welcomed patience. The bread still baked in the wide stone ovens, the sheep still moved quietly through their pens, and the brothers still walked the snow-dusted cloisters in peaceful silence. When spring finally began to stir, its signs faint and slow, the soft drip of melting snow, the thin cracks in the ice along the well, the brothers did not rush to greet it. They welcomed it as they welcomed winter, with calm hearts and steady steps. Brother Henri, now well into his winters, would pass the care of the silver bell to a younger brother, his hands steady as he offered it. "Remember," he would say softly, "the bell is not just a sound. It is a promise. A promise to move gently, to speak softly, to honor the quiet that winter brings." Perhaps now, as you close your eyes and let your breathing slow, you can hear it too, the soft chime of the silver bell of Frostwick, ringing across the snow, a peaceful melody to guide you gently into sleep. Let the snow fall quietly. Let the fire glow softly. Let the silent abbey of Frostwick watch over you through the long, restful night. Sleep well, traveler. The winter keeps you safe. Story 7. The Winter Garden of Hollowmere. A medieval tale for sleep. In the quiet, snow-covered lowlands of the kingdom, nestled between slow rivers and wide fields that slept beneath layers of white, there stood the village of Hollowmere. Hollowmere was a place where winter lingered long, where the wind moved gently through the bare trees, and the snow settled softly upon the rooftops. The world there seemed to slow in winter's careful hands, as though time itself wished to pause, to rest, to simply be still. It is here, in this peaceful village, that our 7th story begins. Hollowmere was not a place of hurry. The days passed with soft rhythm. The bakers rose early to knead their dough in the golden light of lanterns. The weavers sat by windows clouded with frost, their fingers brushing thick wool into gentle patterns. Even the horses in the village stables moved calmly, their breath rising in soft clouds as they waited for their morning oats. But Hollowmere was most known for something else, a quiet wonder that appeared each winter. Behind the old stone church, past the wooden gates and low stone walls, there lay the winter garden, a place unlike any other in the kingdom. Even in the deepest snows, the garden bloomed, not with bright flowers, but with small, hardy herbs, with soft green leaves that curled against the cold, and with delicate white berries that shimmered like tiny stars against the snow. The garden was tended by a woman named Maeve, whose hands were gentle and whose steps were always soft upon the snow. She had tended the winter garden for as long as the villagers could remember, quietly working among the frost-dusted leaves, brushing snow from the branches, and lighting small lanterns that glowed like fireflies along the stone pathways. Maeve's days were slow and careful. She would rise before the pale morning light, wrap herself in layers of wool and linen, and walk the winding paths of the garden, her fingers brushing each plant as if to greet them. The villagers often watched her from a distance, admiring the way she moved among the snow, as though the garden and the winter spoke to her in a language only she could hear. At night, by the warmth of the hearth, Maeve would share the story of the winter garden with the children and the weary travelers who passed through Hollowmere. "Come, sit close," she would say in her soft, calming voice. "Let me tell you how this garden came to grow." She would begin her tale in the same way each time, her words slow and steady, like falling snow. Many winters ago, when Hollowmere was young and the forests still crowded the edges of the fields, a healer lived in the village. She was wise and kind, but she worried for the people who grew sick in the cold months when nothing would grow. She walked the forests, searching for plants that could survive the snow, plants that could bring warmth and comfort when the world was frozen. She found only silence, only frost and bare branches. But instead of giving up, she planted a single seed in the snow, right behind the church, and each day, she tended it with patience. Not with warm sun, but with steady care. Not with rich soil, but with the simple belief that something small could grow even in the cold. And so it did. Slowly, gently, the garden began to bloom, not in summer's bright colors, but in winter's soft greens and pale whites. It grew because it was loved, because it was tended, because winter, too, can be a season of life, if only we move carefully within it. Maeve's stories were not grand, but they settled into the hearts of the villagers like warm embers. They would listen as the snow tapped gently at the windows, the fire crackling softly, the room wrapped in peaceful quiet. The winter garden became a place of comfort. When a child had a fever, Maeve would bring them a small cup of winterberry tea, sweetened with a touch of honey. When the elderly felt the ache of long winters, she would make salves from frost thyme and snowmint, her careful hands preparing each mixture by the soft light of her lantern. The villagers would walk the garden's paths at dusk, their boots pressing softly into the snow, their breathing slow as they paused to admire the small green leaves that poked bravely through the frost. The garden was never loud. It was never grand. It simply existed, quiet, steady, a reminder that life, too, has a place in winter. Maeve taught the children to tend the garden as she did, with patient hands and soft footsteps. "Do not rush," she would tell them. "Winter asks us to slow, to listen, to breathe with care." The days passed gently in Hollowmere. The bakers shaped their loaves with quiet skill. The weavers wove thick cloaks in soft grays and blues. The horses pulled wooden carts at a calm pace, their hooves clicking softly against the snow-covered stones. Even the village dogs, their fur dusted with frost, moved quietly, as though they too understood that winter was not a season to hurry through but to walk within carefully. When the longest night arrived, the deepest part of winter when the sun would set early and the village would glow only by lantern light, the people of Hollowmere gathered in the winter garden. Each person carried a small lantern, its golden flame flickering softly in the cold air. They placed the lanterns along the garden's paths, their warm light weaving through the snow and the green leaves, casting gentle shadows upon the stones. Maeve stood among them, her hands folded calmly, her face peaceful as she spoke. "The winter garden does not fight the cold," she whispered. "It lives with it. It grows because it is tended with patience, with kindness, and with care. So, too, should we move through our winters, with soft steps, with steady hearts." The villagers remained in the garden long after the lanterns were lit, standing together in peaceful silence, the snow drifting slowly around them, the garden glowing quietly beneath their feet. As the days slowly lengthened and the first hints of spring began to touch the air, the winter garden remained. It did not fade with the changing season. It stayed, a gentle reminder that even when the snow returns, life can bloom softly in the cold. Maeve continued to tend the garden, teaching the children, offering her teas and salves, moving carefully along the stone paths. And perhaps now, as you rest and let your breathing slow, you can imagine the soft beauty of the winter garden of Hollowmere, the quiet green leaves, the gentle snowflakes, the calm glow of lanterns weaving through the peaceful white. Let the snow continue to fall. Let the garden grow. Let the soft rhythm of Hollowmere guide you gently into restful sleep. Sleep well, traveler. The winter garden will watch over you tonight. Story 8, The Winter Watcher of Stonebrook, a medieval tale for sleep. In the far eastern valleys of the kingdom, where the rivers curved like silver ribbons and the pines stood tall and silent, there lay a quiet village named Stonebrook. The winters there were long and slow, wrapping the village in soft white blankets, muffling the sound of footsteps, and settling gently on the rooftops like layers of time. Stonebrook was not known for great battles or grand halls. It was known for its stillness. It was a place where the people moved carefully through their days, where the blacksmith's hammer rang softly, and where the weavers spun their wool with steady, unhurried hands. And above the village, standing upon a small stone hill, there stood a lonely wooden tower with a single round window. This was the home of the Winter Watcher. The Winter Watcher was not a title of power nor of fame. It was a quiet duty, passed from one person to the next, through many winters. The Watcher's task was simple: to watch over Stonebrook during the coldest season, to tend the great winter fire, and to ring the soft brass bell that signaled each passing day. Our story begins with a young man named Corwin, who had just become the new Winter Watcher. Corwin was quiet by nature. He enjoyed the silence of falling snow, the slow crackling of firewood, and the peaceful rhythm of the village. When the time came for him to take his place in the watchtower, he accepted with calm hands and steady breath. His days began before the pale sun rose, when the sky was still draped in soft gray. Corwin would light the great winter fire, its steady flame burning day and night in the hearth of the tower. He would sweep the snow from the narrow path that wound up the hill, brushing it aside with slow, careful strokes. Then he would ring the brass bell, a single soft chime that drifted down over the village, a sound the people of Stonebrook cherished. The bell did not call for haste. It did not summon to battle or to work. It was a gentle reminder that the day had begun, and that there was no need to hurry. The villagers would rise at their own pace, tending to their quiet tasks. The bakers would shape their loaves in the warm light of their ovens, their hands steady and slow. The carpenters would smooth wooden planks with patient strokes, their tools moving in rhythm with the falling snow. The children would skate upon the frozen brook, their laughter soft beneath their woolen scarves. At midday, Corwin would climb the narrow wooden steps of the tower once more and ring the bell again, a soft note that drifted like a snowflake upon the wind. And when the pale light of evening settled over the village, he would ring it one final time, its sound blending with the quiet crackle of hearth fires and the hush of snow beneath heavy boots. In the evenings, the people of Stonebrook would gather by their fires, sipping warm broth, their cloaks wrapped tightly around them, their hearts settled by the steady rhythm of their days. Corwin, sitting by the great fire in the tower, would read from the old journals left by the watchers before him. The pages were filled with simple notes, observations of snowfall, the quiet passing of deer, the soft footprints of foxes. Each entry was written in calm, thoughtful words, as though the watchers had known that winter was not something to be measured in haste, but something to be felt in stillness. One evening, as the snow drifted softly against the round window, Corwin found a story written in the careful hand of a watcher from long ago. It is said, the story began, that the winter watcher does not guard the village from danger. There are no enemies in the snow. The watcher's true task is to hold the rhythm of winter, to tend the quiet, to keep the slow pulse of the season steady and warm. Corwin read these words many times, their meaning settling into his heart like a gentle ember. In the days that followed, he moved even more carefully, his steps measured, his hands soft against the wooden railings of the tower. He came to understand that the rhythm he tended was not only in the fire or the bell, but in the calm breathing of the village itself. The people of Stonebrook, too, felt this rhythm. They greeted each other with soft smiles, their voices low and warm. They mended their cloaks and shared their loaves, moving patiently through each snowy morning and each quiet evening. When the longest night arrived, the deep point of winter when the sun dipped low and the world glowed only by lantern light, the village gathered beneath the watchtower. Corwin lit a row of small lanterns, their golden flames flickering against the snow, and then he rang the brass bell, letting its soft chime linger in the cold air. The people stood quietly, their breaths rising like mist, their hearts wrapped in the warmth of shared stillness. In that moment, the snow seemed to pause in its descent, the wind softened, and the village, resting beneath the care of the winter watcher, settled deeper into peaceful rhythm. Corwin did not speak much. His words, like his steps, were careful and few. But on that night, standing before the people, he offered a quiet promise. I will tend the fire. I will keep the rhythm. I will ring the bell. And the people, in return, moved through their days with the same gentle promise, to walk slowly, to breathe steadily, to honor the pace of winter. The longest night passed, as it always did, and the days slowly began to grow brighter, though the snow lingered for many weeks more. Corwin continued to light the fire, sweep the snow, and ring the bell, each chime marking another calm passage through the winter. And when the time came for him to pass the duty to another, he carefully placed the old journals upon the wooden shelf, leaving his own quiet notes for the next watcher. Move gently, he wrote. Ring the bell softly. Winter will carry you if you walk with care. Perhaps now, as you rest, you can imagine the quiet village of Stonebrook beneath the soft snow, the gentle chiming of the bell, the warm crackle of the winter fire, the peaceful footsteps upon the winding paths. Let the snow continue to fall. Let the bell ring softly. Let the winter watcher's rhythm guide you gently into restful sleep. Sleep well, traveler. Stonebrook watches over you tonight. Story End, The Last Winter Song. A medieval tale for sleep. Story End. And so, we come to the last story of our quiet winter journey. A story nestled deep in the soft snow and the peaceful silence of time gone by. There once was a village, so old that its name had gently faded from the maps and from most memories. It was a village wrapped in quiet hills, where the snow always seemed to fall just a little slower, where the rivers moved beneath layers of clear, silent ice, and where winter lingered with a soft, steady patience. The people called it simply the Winter Village. It was the last place where the oldest songs were sung, the last place where the bells of the snow chimed softly in the cold air, and the last place where the rhythm of winter was carefully remembered. In this village, there lived a woman named Ira, whose name meant snow in the ancient tongue. She was the village songkeeper. Not a ruler, not a teacher, but simply one who carried the old songs, the melodies that drifted softly through winter and settled gently in the hearts of those who listened. Ira's voice was not loud. It was not grand. It was soft, like the hush of falling snow, and it wrapped around the villagers like a woolen cloak on a cold morning. Her days were calm. She would walk the snow-covered paths, her boots pressing slow, steady prints into the white, her breath rising like quiet smoke in the crisp air. She would hum as she gathered firewood, as she poured warm broth, as she lit the small lanterns that glowed like golden stars along the village lanes. The people of the winter village moved in the same quiet rhythm. The blacksmith tapped gently at his forge, his tools steady, his pace unhurried. The weavers worked by the soft light of the windows, their fingers moving slowly through wool and thread. Even the village dogs padded softly through the snow, their tails swaying, their breaths calm. Each evening, as the sky turned to a deep velvet blue and the snowflakes drifted in peaceful spirals, the villagers would gather around the great fire in the central square. And there, Ira would sing the winter song, a melody passed from voice to voice, through countless winters, its tune as familiar as the sound of one's own heartbeat. The winter song was simple. It did not speak of battles or victories. It spoke of patience, of tending to the slow fires, of walking gently upon the snow. It was a song of steady hands, of soft footfalls, of sharing warmth and moving as one with the quiet season. Ira's voice would rise softly, and the villagers would close their eyes, their breathing slowing, their shoulders relaxing beneath their thick woolen cloaks. The song seemed to wrap around them, like the snow itself, soothing, steady, and full of quiet memory. Winter is not to be hurried, Ira would remind them. It is to be walked within carefully and with care. One winter, when the snow lay especially deep and the sky lingered in soft grays for many days, Ira noticed that the song was beginning to fade from the younger voices. The children, curious and bright, had begun to ask what would happen if the winter song was forgotten, if the melody was no longer sung when the snow fell. Ira smiled, her voice as warm as a woolen scarf. The song is not just words or notes. It is in the way we move, in the way we carry firewood with steady arms, in the way we greet one another with soft smiles, in the way we sweep the snow from the stone paths not with haste, but with patience. The winter song, she said, lives in the rhythm of our days. And so, she began to teach not only the melody, but the pace of the village itself, the slow shaping of bread, the calm weaving of baskets, the gentle lighting of lanterns. She showed the children how to listen to the snow as it landed softly upon pine branches, how to feel the quiet breath of the winter wind against their cheeks, how to walk carefully so that their footprints would press firmly into the snow, each step a note in the silent music of winter. The days passed slowly, wrapped in soft grays and the pale glow of lantern light. The village moved gently, each task an act of remembrance, each careful step a verse in the winter song. When the longest night came, the deepest, quietest part of the season, the villagers gathered around the great fire as they always did. Ira stood among them, her voice steady, her breath soft in the cold air. "Tonight," she said gently, "we sing not only with our voices, but with our hearts, with our steady hands, with our patient breathing. We are the winter song." And so they sang, not loudly, not quickly, but softly, letting the melody drift like snowflakes into the dark sky. The song moved through the village, across the fields, over the frozen streams, and into the sleeping forests. The bells tied to the lanterns chimed softly in the breeze, a sound that mingled with the fading notes of the song, a quiet echo that would linger long after the last voice had fallen silent. In the days that followed, the rhythm of the village continued. The snow still fell, the bread still rose, the wool still warmed the weaver's hands. The winter song, Ira knew, would not fade, not as long as the people tended it, not as long as they walked gently within their winters. Ira grew older, her steps a little slower, her hands a little more careful. But she smiled often, content that the song had found its home in the hearts of her people. When it was time for her to pass on the role of songkeeper, she chose a young girl named Lyra, who had learned not only the melody but the quiet rhythm of winter life. Ira's parting words were simple: sing slowly, walk carefully, the snow will carry your song. And perhaps now, as you rest and let your breathing slow, you can hear it too, the soft notes of the winter song drifting gently across the snow, wrapping you in its steady rhythm, guiding you softly into peaceful sleep. Let the snow continue to fall. Let the lanterns glow warmly. Let the last winter song cradle you as you drift into quiet dreams. Sleep well, traveler. The winter song will keep you safe tonight.